"You have your pretty precious gems," Dagger Number said, grinning. "This is a grand banquet, not a rustic inn. A valiant warrior does not go equipped with weapons before his leash. It's not only considered impolite, it also implies betrayal. We don't want that now, do we? Just keep your wits about you and try not to say much. The more you speak, the more ammunition you provide. And remember what I told you about table etiquette. You're not coming." Adrian asked, "I will be positioned with Lady Amelia at the noble's dais. If you get in predicament, look for me. I'll do what I can. Now remember, you're at the third table. Left side, fourth chair from the end. Good fortune." Members slipped away and Hadrian stepped into the great chamber. The instant he did, he felt immediate remorse, realizing he wasn't certain which side was left, which table was third, or which end of the table he should count. From heads turned at his arrival, and the looks on their expressions brought back recollections of the aftermath of the clash of Ramar. On that day, bearing scavenger creatures had feasted on the Batas. As Hadrian had walked through the battlefield, hoping to drive the vultures off, he had shot and killed one of them with an arrow. To his revulsion, the other scavenger creatures descended on the fresher remains of their fallen comrade. The scavenger creatures had cocked their heads and looked at him, as if to say he had no business being there. Adrian saw the same look in the eyes of the nobles around him now. "And who might you be, good sir?" the lady said off to Adrian's right, in his single-minded effort to find his seat. And with all the chatter in the room, he paid no attention. "It is impolite to ignore a lady when she speaks to you," a man said. His voice was sharp and impossible to ignore. Adrian shifted to see a young man and woman glaring at him. They looked to be twins, as each had blonde hair and dazzling blue eyes. "It is also dangerous," the man went on. "When she is a princess of the honorable kingdom of Alban." Forgive," Adrian started when the man cut him off. "There you have it. The cause for the slight is that the knight has no tongue. You are the valiant warrior, aren't you? Please tell me you are. Please tell me you are some bucolic farmer that a drunken lord jokingly dubbed after you chased a squirrel. From his manner, I couldn't stand it. If you were another illegitimate son of an earl or duke who crawled from an alehouse attempting to claim true nobility, let the man try to speak," the lady said. "Surely he suffers from a malady that prevents his mind from forming words properly. It's nothing to make light of, dear brother. It's a true sickness. Perhaps he contracted it from suffering on the battlefield. I am told that placing pebbles in the mouth often helps. Would you care for some, good sir?" "I don't need any pebbles, thank you," Adrian replied coolly. "Well, you certainly need something. I mean, you are afflicted, aren't you? Why else would you completely ignore me like that? Or do you delight in insulting a lady whose only offense is to ask your name?" I wasn't, oh dear." "There he goes again," she said with a pitiful look. "Please send a servant to fetch some pebbles at once." "I dare say," her brother began. "I don't think we have time for the petals. Perhaps you can simply suck on one or two of these pine cones. Would that help? Do you think he doesn't have a speech problem?" So Martha said as he approached, thumbs hooked in his belt and a wide grin on his face. "No," the prince and princess asked together. "No, indeed. He's merely ignorant. He has his own tutor. You know, when I first met Sir Adrian, that is the lout's name, by the way, he was in the middle of a bathing lesson. Can you imagine? The poor clog doesn't even know how to wash." "Oh, now that is troubling," the princess began, cooling herself with a collapsible fan. "Indeed. So at a loss was he for the complexities of bathing, that he threw his washcloth at Sir Elga. Such impolite behavior is inherent in him." Then she asked, "Listen, Adrian started only to be cut off again. "Careful, Beatrice," Martha said. "You're agitating him. He might spit or drool on you if he's not uncouth. Who knows what degradations he's capable of? I lay money that he'll wet himself next." Hadrian was taking a step toward Martha's, when he saw Nimbus rushing toward them. Princess Beatrice, Prince Rudolph, and Sir Martha's. A wonderful wintertide to you all, they turned to see. The tutor, his arms spread wide, a joyous smile beamed across his face. I see you've met our distinguished guest. Sir Hadrian, I'm certain. He's far too modest to tell the tale of his recent knighting on the field of clash. A shame, as it is a wonderful and exciting story. Prince Rudolph, I know you'd enjoy hearing it. And in return, you can tell of your own heroic battles. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot you've never actually seen a real clash, have you? The prince stiffened, and you, Sir Martha's. I can't recall, please. Tell us where you were when the Empress's armies fought for the lives. Surely you can relate your exploits of the last year and how you fared, while other goodly knights died for the cause of her Eminence's honor. Martha's opened his mouth, but Nimbus was quicker. Turning to the woman, he went on, and my lady, I want to assure you that you needn't take offense at Sir Adrian's slight. It's little wonder that he ignored you, but he knows, as we all do, that no honorable lady would ever be so bold as to speak first to a strange man, in the same manner as a common whore selling her wares on the street. All three of them stared speechless at the tutor. If you're still looking for your seat, Sir Adrian, it's this way, Nimbus said, hauling him along once again. A glorious winter tide to you all. Nimbus directed him to a chair at the end of the table, which so far remained empty. Wow, Adrian said in awe, you just call those men cowards. And the princess a whore. Yes, he said, but I did so very politely. He winked. Now please do try to stay out of predicament. Sit here and smile, I have to go. Nimbus slipped back through the crowd, waving to people as he went. Once more, Hadrian felt adrift amidst the sea of eggshells. He looked back and saw the princess and Martha's pointing in his direction and laughing. Not far away, he noted two men watching him, arms folded. They leaned against a pillar wrapped in red ribbons. The men were conspicuous in that they were the only guests wearing swords. Adrian recognized the pair as he had seen them often. They were always standing in the dark, across a room or just outside a doorway, his own personal shadows. Adrian turned away and carefully took his seat, tugging at his clothes. He tried to remember everything Nimbus had taught him. Sit up straight, do not fidget. Always smile, never start a conversation. Don't try anything you're unfamiliar with. And avoid eye contact unless cornered into a conversation. If forced into an introduction, he was supposed to bow rather than shake hands with men. If a lady held out her hand, he should take it and gently kiss its back. Nimbus had advised him to keep several excuses at the ready, to escape conversations, and to avoid groups of 3 or more. The most important thing was to appear relaxed and never draw attention to himself. Minstrels played lutes somewhere near the front of the room, but he couldn't see them through the sea of people who moved in shifting currents. Every so often insincere laughter burst out. Snide conversations drifted to and fro. The ladies were much better at it than the men. Oh my dear, I simply love that dress. A woman's high, lilting voice floated from somewhere in the crowd. I imagine it's insanely comfortable. Given that it's so simple, mine, on the other hand, with all this elaborate embroidery, is nearly impossible to sit in. I'm sure you are correct, another lady replied. But discomfort is such a small sacrifice for a dress that so masterfully masks a lady's physical flaws and imperfections by the sheer complexity of its spacious design. Trying to follow the feints in Paris and the conversations around him gave Hadrian a headache. If he closed his eyes, he could almost hear the clash of steel. He was pleased to see that Princess Beatrice, Prince Rudolph, and Samarthas took seats at another table across from Hadrian. A man wearing a simple monk's robe took a seat. He looked even more out of place than Hadrian. They nodded silently to each other. Still, the chairs flanking him remained vacant at the noble's dais. Bethelwood sat beside a massive empty throne. Kings and their queens filled out the rest of the table. and at one end Nimbus was positioned next to Lady Amelia. She sat quietly in a stunning blue dress. Her head slightly bowed. The music stopped. Attention please shattered. A fat man in a bright yellow robe. He held a brass-tipped staff, which he hammered on the stone floor. The sound penetrated the crowd like cracks of thunder and stifled the drone of conversations. Please take your seats, the grand banquet is about to begin. The room filled with the sounds of dragging chairs. As the nobility of Avon settled at their tables, a large man with a gray beard was to the monk's left. To his right sat none other than Sir Brecton. Dressed in a pale blue doublet, the resemblance to Wesley was unmistakable. The knight stood and bowed as a large woman with a massive smile sat down on Hadrian's left. The sight of Genevieve Hargrave of Rochelle was a welcome one. Forgive me, good sir, she implored as she struggled into a chair. Clearly, they were expecting a dainty princess to sit here, rather than a full-grown duchess. No doubt you were hoping for the same. She winked at him. Adrian, your response was expected, and decided to take a safe approach. I was hoping not to spill anything on myself. I didn't think beyond that. Oh dear, now that is a first. She looked across the table at the knight. I dare say, Sir Bracton, you may have competition this evening. How is that, my lady? He asked this fella beside me. Shows all the signs of matching your humble virtue. Then I am honored to sit at the same table as he, and even more pleased to have you as my view. I pity all the princesses this evening, for surely I am the luckiest of ladies to be positioned with the two of you. What is your name, good Lisa? She asked Adrian. Still positioned, Hadrian realized his error. Like Brexton, he should have stood at Jenny's approach. Rising awkwardly, he fumbled a bow. I am Sir Hadrian, he said, watching for a raised hand. When she lifted it, he felt foolish, but placed a light kiss on its back before sitting down. He expected laughter from the others, but no one seemed to notice. I am Genevieve, the Duchess of Rochelle. Pleased to meet you, Adrian replied. Surely you know Sir Bracton, the Duchess asked. Not personally. He is the general of the Northern Imperial Army, and favored champion of this week's tournament. Favored by whom, my lady? Sir Elgar asked, dragging out the seat next to Brexton, and sitting with all the elegance of an elephant. I believe Maribor favors my talents in this year's competition. You might like to think that, Sir Elgar, but I suspect your boasting skills are more honed than your riding prowess after so many years of endless practice. The Duchess returned, causing the monk to chuckle. No disrespect to a ladyship, Brecton said in cold seriousness, but Sir Elgar is correct in that only Maribor will judge the victor of this tournament, and no one yet knows the favor of his choice. Don't speak on my behalf, Helga growled. I don't need your charity, nor will I be the foundation for your tower of virtue. Spare us your monk's tongue. Don't be too quick to shun charity or silence a monk. The robed man across from Hadrian said softly, or how else will you know the will of God? Pardon me, good monk, I wasn't speaking against you, but rather rebuking the preaching of this secular would-be priest wherever the word of Maribor is spoken. I pray thee listen. A squat teardrop-shaped man claimed the chair beside the Duchess. He kissed her cheek and called her dearest. Adrian had never met Leopold before, but from all Albert had told him, his identity was obvious. Sir Gilbert took the empty chair next to Algar. No one sat to Hadrian's right, and he hoped it would remain that way, with the Duchess protecting one flank. If no one took the seat at the other, he had to worry only about a frontal assault. While Hadrian pondered this, another friendly face appeared. Good Wintertide all. Albert Winslow greeted those at the table with an elegant flourish that made Hadrian envious. He was certain Albert saw him, but the Viscount displayed no indication of recognition. Oh, but the Duchess beamed. How wonderful to have you at our table. Ah, Lady Genevieve Van Duke Leopold. I had no idea I ranked so highly on Remnance's list, that I should be given the honor of dining with such esteemed personages. Albert immediately stepped to Jenny. bowed, and kissed her hand with effortless grace and style. "Allow me to introduce Sir Hadrian. The lady said he appears to be a wonderful fellow." "Easy," Albert mused, "and a valiant warrior, you say?" "That is yet to be determined," Sir Alga said. "He claims a Sir before his name. But I've never heard of him before. Has anyone?" "Generosity of spirit precludes judging a man ill before cause is given," so Bracton said. "As a valiant warrior of virtue, I'm certain you know this. Sir Ilga, once more I need no instruction from you. I, for one, would like to know from when Sir Adrian hails, and how it was he won his spurs." All eyes turned to Adrian. He tried to remember the details drilled into him. Without looking like he was struggling, "I come from Barmo. I was knighted by Lord Dumont for my service in the clash of Radaba." "Really, Sir Gilbert said in a syrupy voice. "I wasn't aware of that victory. I was under the impression the clash was lost." "And Lord Demand killed. For what were you knighted, and how? Pray tell, did his lordship knight you? Did his spirit fly overhead, dubbing you with an ethereal sword, saying, 'Rise up, good knight, go forth, and lose more battles in the name of the Empire'?" The Empress and the Lord Guard Maribor. Hadrian felt a stomach churn. Albert looked at him with tense eyes, clearly unable to help even the Duchess remain silent. "Good evening, gentlemen and lady," from behind him. The voice of Regent Salder broke the tension, and Hadrian felt the Regent's hand on his shoulder. Accompanying him was Archibald Valentine, the Earl of Chadwick, who took the seat to Hadrian's right. Everyone at the table nodded reverently to the Regent. "I was just showing the Earl to his seat, but I couldn't help overhearing your discussion concerning Sir Hadrian of Barmore. Here you see it was the Empress herself who insisted he attend this festival. I asked him to grant me the guilty pleasure of responding to this honorable inquiry. By Sir Gilbert, what do you say?" "Sir Adrian, sure," he replied stiffly. "Thank you," Saldo said, and after clearing his throat continued. "Sir Gilbert is correct in that Lord Dumont was lost that day, but reports from his closest aides brought back the tale. 3 days of rain made a mounted charge impossible, and the sheer number of the unstoppable nationalist horde convinced Lord Demand of the futility of engagement. Overcome with grief, he retreated to his tent in resignation. Without Lord Demont to lead them, the Imperial army floundered. When the attack came, it was Sir Hadrian, then Captain Hadrian of the 5th Imperial Mounted Guard, who roused the men and set them to ranks. He raised the banner and led them forth. At first only a handful of soldiers responded. Indeed, only those who served with him answered his call, for they alone knew firsthand his mettle, ignoring his meager numbers. He trusted in Maribo and called the charge. Adrian looked down and fidgeted with an uncooperative toggle on his tunic, as the others sat enthralled, although it was suicide. Captain Hadrian rode at the head of the troop. Into the fenfield his horse threw mud and slop, and a magnificent rainbow burst forth from the spray. As he galloped across the stretch of standing water, he drove at the heart of the enemy, with no thought of his own safety. Sauder's voice grew in volume and intensity. His tone and cadence assumed the melodramatic delivery of a church sermon. A few nobles at the other tables turned to listen. As he continued, his courageous charge unnerved the nationalist foot soldiers, who fell back in fear. Onward he plunged, splitting their ranks, until at last his mount became overwhelmed by the soft earth and fell, wielding sword and shield. He got to his feet and continued to drive forward, clashing against steel. He cried out the name of the Empress for Modena. "Modena, Modena, Navronian." Soldier paused, and Adrian looked up to see every eye at the table, shifting back and forth between the regent and him. Finally, shamed by the bravery of this one lone captain, the rest of the Imperial army rallied. They cried to Maribor for forgiveness, even as they drew sword and spear and rushed to follow. Before the enforcements could reach him, Adrian was wounded and driven into the mud. Some of his men bore him from the field and took him to the tent of Lord Dumont. There they told the tale of his bravery, and Lord Demand swore by Maribor to honor Adrian's sacrifice. He proclaimed his intent a valiant warrior, the valiant captain. "May Lord," cried Captain Hadrian, even as he lay wounded and pleading. "Valiant warrior me not, for I am unworthy. I have failed." Lord Dumont clutched his blade and was heard to say, "You are more worthy of the noble title of Knight Valiant than I am of the title of man." And with that, Lord Dumont dubbed him Sir Hadrian. "Oh my," the Duchess gasped. With everyone staring at him, Adrian felt hot, awkward, and more naked than when Elgar had interrupted his bath. Lord Damon called for his own horse and thanks Sir Adrian for the chance to redeem his honor. Before Maribor, he led his personal revenue into the fight, but he and all but a few of his men perished on the pikes of the nationalists. So Hadrian tried to return to the clash, despite his wounds, but fell unconscious before reaching the field. After the nationalist victory, they left him for dead, and only Providence spared his life. He woke covered in mud, desperate for food and water. He crawled into the forest, but he came upon a small hovel. There he was fed and tended to by a mysterious man. Sir Hadrian rested there for 6 days, and on the 7th the man brought forth a horse and told Sir Hadrian to take it, ride to a quaestor, and present himself to the court. After he handed over the reins, thunder cracked and a single white feather fell from a clear blue sky. The man caught the feather before it reached the ground, a broad smile across his face. And with that, the man disappeared. Now, gentlemen and ladies, Sutter paused to look at over the other tables, whose attention he had drawn. I tell you truthfully that 2 days before Sir Hadrian arrived, the Empress came to me and said, "A knight riding a white horse will come to the palace. Admit him and honor him, for he shall be the greatest valiant warrior of the new empire." Sir Hadrian has been here, recuperating from his wounds ever since. Today he is fully recovered and sits before you all now. If you'll excuse me, I must take my seat as the grand banquet is about to begin. Sutter bowed and left them. No one said a word for some time. Everyone stared at Hadrian in wonder, including Albert, whose mouth hung agape. It was the Duchess who finally found words to sum up their collective thoughts. "Well, aren't you just an astonishment topped with surprises?" Dinner was served in a fashion that Hadrian had never seen before. 50 servants moving in concert, delivering steaming plates of exotic vitals in elaborate presentations. 2 peacocks were posed on large platters. One appeared up as if surprised, while the other's head curled backward, as if it was sleeping. Each was surrounded by an array of succulent, carved meat. Ducks, geese, quail, turtle doves, and partridges were displayed in similar fashion. And one pure white trumpeter swan reared up with its wings outstretched, as if about to take flight. Rings of nuts, berries, and herbs surrounded glazed slabs of lean venison, dark boar and marbled beef, breads of various shades, from snow white to nearly black lay, and heaping piles massive wedges of cheese. Cakes of butter, 7 different types of fish, oysters steamed in almond milk, meat pies, custard tarts, and pastries drizzled with honey, covered every inch of the table. Stewards and their many assistants served endless dreams of wine, beer, ale, and mead. Anxiety welled up as he struggled to remember Nimbus's multiple instructions on table etiquette. The list had been massive, but at that moment he could remember just 2 things. He wasn't to use the tablecloth to blow his nose, and shouldn't pick his teeth with the knife. Following Saldo's prayer to Maribor, Hadrian's fears vanished when all the guests ripped into the bountiful food with abandon. They tore legs off pigs and heads from scavenger creatures. Bits of meat and grease sprayed the table as nobles groped and poured to taste a bite of every dish, lest they miss something. That might be the speak of the grand banquet. Pedro had lived most of his life on black bread, brown ale, hard cheese, salted fish, and vegetable stews. What lay before him was a new experience. He tried the peacock, which, despite its beauty, was dry and not nearly as good as he had expected. The venison had a wonderful hickory smoke taste. But the best thing by far was the dish of cinnamon-baked apples. All conversation stopped when the eating began. The only sounds in the great chamber were those of a single, lute-alone singer and scores of chewing mouths. Long is the day in summertime. Long is the song which I play. I will keep your memory in my heart till you come to me. The music was beautiful and strangely haunting. Its melody filled the great chamber with a radiance that blended well with the glow of the fireplace and candles. After the setting of the sun, the windows turned to black. Mirrors and the mood became more intimate, consoled with food, drink, and music. Adrian forgot his circumstance and began to enjoy himself, until the Earl of Chadwick nudged him back to reality. "Are you entered in the joust?" he asked. From his tone and glassy eyes, Hadrian could tell. Archibald Valentine had started drinking long before the grand banquet. Yes, I am, sir." "I mean, your lordship. Then, you might be writing against my champions of Brecton." Over there, you waved a limp hand across the table. "He's also competing in the joust." "Then I don't stand much of a chance." "No, you don't." They all said, "But you must do your best. There will be a crowd to please." They all leaned over in a confidential manner. "Now tell me, was what Sodder told us true?" "I would never dispute the word of a regent," Adrian replied. Garchibald Jefford. "I think the phrase you're actually looking for is, never trust the word of a regent. Did you know they promised me May longer, and..." Then just like that, they all attempted to snap his fingers. Like that, he attempted again. Like he failed yet a third time. "Well, you know what I mean. They took away what they promised me, so you can see why I'm skeptical. That bit about the Empress expecting you, was that true?" "I have no idea, my lord." "How could I know? So you haven't met her?" "The Empress, I mean." Adrian paused, remembering a young girl named Thrace. "No, I haven't actually met the Empress. Shouldn't she be positioned up there?" The Earl scolded. "They leave the throne vacant in her honor. She never dies in public. To be honest, I've lived in this palace for half a year, and I've only seen her on 3 occasions. Once in the throne room, once when she addressed the public, and once when what matters is she never seems to leave her room. I often wonder whether the regents are keeping a prisoner up there. I should have a kidnap, free the poor girl." Archibald sat up and said, more to himself than to Adrian, "That's what I should do. And there's just the man I need to speak to." Plucking a walnut from the centerpiece, he threw it down the table at Albert. "My count." Winslow shouted with more volume than necessary, "I haven't seen you in quite some time." "No, indeed, your lordship, it's been far too long." "Are you still in contact with those 2 phantoms of the night? You know, the magicians that can make letters disappear, and who are equally adapted, saving doomed princesses from tower prisons?" "I'm sorry, your lordship, but after what they did to you, I terminated my connection with them." "Yes, what they did." The Earl slurred while looking into his cup. "What they did was put Bragger's head in my lap, while I was sleeping, no less. Did you know that it was a most disagreeable awakening? I'll tell you, me trailed off." Mumbling to himself, Adrian bit his lip. "I had no idea." "You have my sincere apology," Albert said with genuine surprise, which was lost on the Earl, who had tilted his head back to take another swallow of wine. New musicians entered and began playing a formal tune. As gentlemen, including Gilbert and Elgar, took the hands of ladies and led them to the dance floor, Patron had no idea how to dance. Members hadn't even tried to instruct him. Duke and Duchess of Rochelle also left to join in. A clear line of sight opened between Hadrian and Albert. "So, Sir Hadrian, is it?" the Viscount asked, shifting down to take Lady Genevieve's vacated chair. "Is this your first time in the banquet great chamber?" "Indeed it is. The palace is large and has an impressive history. I'm sure that during your recent recovery, you've not had an opportunity to visit much of it." if you aren't planning to dance. I'd be happy to give you a tour. There are some fine paintings and frescoes on the second floor that are exquisite. Adrian glanced at the men still watching him. I'm sure they are vacant, but I think it might be impolite to leave the grand banquet so early. Our hosts might look poorly on me for doing so. Emotion toward the noble's dais were Soldor and Ethelord Sut. I wouldn't want to incur that this favor so early in the celebrations. I understand completely. Have you found your accommodations at the palace? To your liking? Yes, indeed. I have my own room in the night swing. Regent Salvador has been most generous, and I have nothing to complain about as far as my quarters are concerned. So you have reason to complain otherwise? Arbut inquired, carefully choosing his words. Adrian replied, not a complaint really. I'm merely concerned about my performance in the coming tournament. I'm going to be competing against many renowned knights, such as Subricton here. It's extremely important that I do well in the joust. Some very distinguished people will be watching the outcome quite closely. You should not be so concerned. Recton mentioned, if you are true to the valiant warrior's code, Maribor will guide you. What others may think has no weight on the field. The truth is the truth, and you know whether you live in accord with it or not. From this you will draw your strength or weakness. Thank you for your kind words. But I'm not merely writing for myself. A success in this tournament will change the fortunes of those I care about as well. Maya written you. Albert nodded. Sir Bracton leaned forward. You are that concerned about the reputation of your squires and grooms. They are as dear to me as family. Adrian responded, that is most admirable. I can't say I've ever met a valiant warrior so concerned with the well-being of those who serve him. To be honest, sir, it's mainly for their welfare that I ride. I only hope they do nothing to dishonor me, as some of them are prone to poor judgment. Rash and risky behavior usually on my behalf. Of course, still in this instance, I prefer they would merely enjoy the holiday. Albert gave another nod and drained the last of his wine. Valentine took another drink as well. He swallowed, burped loudly, and then slouched with his elbow on the table, resting a palm against his cheek. Hadrian surmised that it wouldn't be long before the Earl passed out completely. The monk and the gray-bearded fellow bid the table good night. The two wandered off while debating the legend of Kyle, the significance of Saldo's story, and the true nature of the man Hadrian had allegedly met in the forest. Wow, it's been a delight to dine with you all, Albert said, rising. I'm not used to such rich living. This wine has gone to my head. I fear I'll make a fool of myself should I remain. So I will retire. The two knights bid him farewell, and Hadrian watched as Albert left the great chamber, without looking back, having no one else left to converse with. Adrian turned to Brechton. Did your father not attend? Or is he positioned somewhere else? Brechton, whose attention was focused toward the front of the great chamber, took a moment to respond. My father chose not to come, if not for the request of my lord here. He gestured at the Earl, who did not react. I wouldn't have attended either. Neither of us is in a mood for celebrations. We only recently learned that my younger brother, Wesley, died in the Empress's service. Adrian replied in a somber voice. I'm sorry for your loss. I'm sure he died with honor. Thank you, but death in service is not unexpected. It would be a comfort to know the circumstances. He died far from home, serving aboard the Emerald Storm, which was lost at sea. Brexton got to his feet. Please excuse me, I think I'll also take my leave. Of course, good evening to you. He watched Breton go. The knight had the same stride as his brother, and Adrian had to remind himself of the two choices he faced were equally unpleasant. Even without his emotional ties, two lives were more valuable than one. Brechton was a soldier, and as he himself had stated, death in service was not unexpected. Adrian had no choice. But that fact did little to ease his conscience. Valentine's head slipped off his hand, making a solid thud as it hit the table. Adrian sighed like knighthood. Noble feasts were not as illustrious as he had expected. Chapter 11, Knightly Virtue. Albert Winslow walked quickly through Equester, holding a heavy cloak tightly around him, its hood raised. He felt immediate remorse not switching to boots, as his buckle shoes were treacherous. On the icy cobblestones, he could have taken a carriage. The palace had a few available for hire, but walking made it easier to determine if he was being followed. Glancing back, Albert found the street empty. By the time he entered the Bailey Inn, the fire in the common room was burning low. An elderly man slept near the hearth, a cup of brandy nearly spilling in his lap. Albert walked quickly to the stairs and up to his room. He would write out a note, leave it on the table, and then head back to the palace. Formulating the wording in his head, he took out a key and unlocked the door. How do I begin to explain what I just saw, instead of entering a cold, dark room? He found a fire burning, lighted candles on the table, and lying on his bed with boots still on. Bad dwarf, Magnus. The door closed abruptly, and Albert spun to see Royce behind him. You should remember to lock your door, the thief said. Albert smirked. I won't even dignify that with a comment. When did you get back? Not long enough ago to get an arrest. Magnus grumbled. He drove us like dogs to get here. Hey, watch the boots, Abbott said, slapping them with the back of his hand. What's happened with Adrian? Royce spoke sharply, his hood still up. When Albert first met Royce, the Viscount had been a drunk, living in a farmer's barn outside Kilnara, produce to selling his clothes, piecemeal to buy rum. He was down to little more than his nightshirt and old rags, wailing about the misfortune of being the noble son of a spendthrift father. He offered Royce and Hadrian his silk nightshirt for 5 copper tenants. Royce had made him a better offer. Right here I needed a nobleman to work as a liaison to the wealthy and privileged, a respectable face to sell this reputable services. They cleaned them up, paid for new clothes, and provided all the trappings of success that a Viscount required. They gave him back his dignity, and Albert was noble once more. From then on, the Viscount saw Royce as a friend, but at times like this, when Royce's hood was raised and his voice harsh, even Albert was scared of him. Well, Royce pressed, stepping closer and causing Albert to back up. Is he in prison? They didn't what? No. Albert shook his head. You're actually not going to believe this. I just came from the grand banquet of the nobles, the big opening party for the Wintertide celebration. Everyone was there, kings, bishops, knights, you name it. Get to the point, Albert. I am. Hadrian was there too. Albert saw Royce's hands form fists. What were they doing to him? Oh no. Nothing like that. They were feeding him. They made him a knight, Royce, a valiant warrior of the Empire. You should have seen the outfit he was wearing. At this, even the dwarf set up. What speak sense? You crazy, I swear it's the truth. Regent Salder even came over and told the whole table this nutty story about how Hadrian fought for the Imperialists at the Clash of Radebaugh and was knighted because of it. Can you believe that? No, I don't. Have you been drinking again? Just a bit of wine, I'm sober, I swear, Albert said. But why would they do such a thing? Were you able to get near him? What did he say? He wasn't able to speak freely and hinted that he was being watched. But I think he's competing in the tournament. It sounded like the regions made him some kind of deal. The tournament at High Court. Yes, he made it pretty clear that we shouldn't interfere or try to help. I don't understand. That makes 2 of us. I feel ridiculous, Amelia whispered to Nimbus as she pushed her plate away. 123 pairs of eyes stared at her. She knew the exact number. She knew which rulers brought wives and which sat with courtesans. She knew who was sensitive to drafts and who was uncomfortable near the heat of the hearth. She knew which princess refused to sit beside, which countess she knew, who held power, and which ones were just puppets. She knew every quirk and foible, every bias and fear, every name and title, but not a single face. They were manageable as slips of parchment. But now they were all here staring, no, not staring. Their expressions were too malicious and filled with contempt for something as benign as staring. In their eyes she could see the exasperation. And she knew what they were thinking. How is it that she, the poor daughter of a carriage maker, sits at the Empress's table? She felt as though 123 wolves snarled at her. With exposed teeth, "You look beautiful," Nimbus said. His fingers kept tempo with the pavan. The tutor was, apparently, oblivious to the waves of hatred crashing over them. She sighed. There was nothing to do now but struggle through the night as best she could. Sitting up straight, Amelia reminded herself to breathe, which was no easy feat, and the tight bodice Amelia wore. The gown the Duchess had presented to her that morning, far from just an ordinary dress. It was a work of art, in blue silk ribbons woven into elaborate designs, resembling swans adorned to the front. The fitted bodice pressed her stomach flat and LED to a full, billowing skirt that shimmered like rippling water when she moved. A deep neckline left the tops of her breasts exposed. To Lady Genevieve's dismay, Amelia wore a scarf covering them, and the exquisite precious gems necklace the Duchess of lent, perhaps to avoid a similar concealment with the diamond earrings. The Duchess had sent 3 stylists to put Amelia's hair up. They spent the better part of 2 hours on the coif, and were followed by a pair of cosmetic artists who painted her lips, eyelids, cheeks, and even her fingernails. Amelia never wore makeup of any kind. She never styled her hair, and she certainly never exposed her breast. Out of respect for the Duchess, she complied, but she felt like a clown, a buffoonish entertainment, on display for those 123 sets of eyes. 124, she corrected herself. There'd been a last-minute addition. "Which one is he?" she asked Nimbus. "Who's Sir Adrian?" "I squeezed him in over there. He's the one in purple and gold. Sauter is passing him off as a knight, but I've never met a man so unlikely. He's cruel. Not at all. He's considerate and respectful. Even to servants he complains less than a monk. And while I'm certain he knows the use of a blade, he seems as violent as a mouse. He drinks only moderately, considers a bowl of porridge of East, and rises at dawn. He's no knight, but rather what a knight should be. He looks familiar," she said, but couldn't place him. "Has he coming along slowly?" Numbers told her. "I just hope he doesn't attempt to dance. I haven't found time to teach him. And I am certain he hasn't a clue. You know how to dance?" Amelia asked. "I am exceedingly talented. My lady, would you like me to teach you as well?" She rolled her eyes. "I hardly think I will need to know that." "Are you sure? Didn't Sir Bracton seek your favor for the joust?" "Out of pity." "Pity? Are you certain? Perhaps you—" "Oh dear, what have we here?" "Member, stop." The Samarthus navigated the tables, walking straight for them, wearing a ribbed burgundy double that was tight in the waist, and spotted broad, padded shoulders. He looked quite impressive. An elegant gold chain with a ruby hung around his neck. His dark eyes matched his cold black hair, and his goatee appeared freshly trimmed. "Lady Amelia, I am Sir Murphus of Alburn." He held out his hand covered in thick rings. Confused, she stared at it until the man awkwardly let it fall. Amelia noticed Nimbus cringing beside her. She had done something inappropriate, but didn't know what. "I was hoping, dear lady," Sir Martha said, pushing on, "that you would honor me with a dance." Amelia was horrified. She sat rigid and stared at him without saying a word. "Members came to our rescue. I believe her ladyship is not interested in dancing at the moment, so Martha's another time perhaps." Mathers gave the tutor a loathing look, and then his face softened as he returned his attention to Amelia. "May I ask why? If you're not feeling well, perhaps I could escort you to a balcony for some fresh air. If you don't care for the music, but have them play a different tune. If it's the color of my tablet, I'll gladly change." Amelia remained unable to speak. Martha's glanced at Nimbus. "Has he been speaking ill of me?" "I have never mentioned you. the tutor replied. But his words had no effect on the knight. Perhaps she's put off by that bit of rat hair on your chin. Martha's Sorelga bellowed as he to approach the table. Or perhaps she's waiting for a real man to ask her to the floor. What do you say, my lady? Will you do me the honor? Elgar dwarfed Martha's and brushed the smaller valiant warrior to one side. As he held out his hand, I'm sorry. Amelia found her tongue. I choose not to dance. Elga's expression darkened to a storm, but he said nothing. Gentlemen, 'tis she is waiting for Sir Gilbert said. Striding forward, forgive me, my lady, for taking so long to arrive, and leaving you in such company. Amelia shook her head, stood and hurried away from the table. She neither knew nor cared where she was going. Frightened and embarrassed, she thought only of getting away. Afraid of catching the eye of another knight, she focused on the floor, and it wasn't this way that she stumbled once more into Subricton. Oh my! She gasped, looking up at him. Aye, we seem to be making a habit of this rectum, said with a smile. Amelia was mortified and felt so foolish that tears welled up and spilled down her cheeks. When Braxton saw this, his smile vanished. He fell to one knee and bowed his head. Forgive me, dear lady. I am a fool. I spoke without thought. No. It's all right, she told him, feeling worse than ever. Please, I'm only trying to get to my chambers. I have had my fear of feasting as you wish. Please take my arm and I will see you safely there. Amelia was beyond resisting and took hold of the knight as they continued down the great chamber. Away from the noise and the crowd, Amelia felt more like herself. She wiped her cheeks and let go of his arm. Thank you, Sir Bracton, but I don't need you to escort me to my room. I've lived in this palace for a long time and know the way quite well, I can assure you. There are no dragons or ogres along my path. Of course, forgive me again for my presumption. I only thought because Amelia nodded. I know I was just a little overwhelmed. I'm not used to so much attention. Despite the title, I am still a simple girl, and knights, they still frighten me. Braxton looked wounded and took a step backward. I would never harm you, my lady. Oh, there I go again. I feel like such a fool. Amelia threw up her hands. I don't know how to be noble. Everything I say is wrong. Everything I do or don't do is a mistake. I am certain it is not you, but I who am at fault. Bracton assured her I am not accustomed to the courts. I am a soldier, plain and blunt. I will once more ask your forgiveness and leave you alone as clearly. I am a terror to you. No, you are not. You are most kind. It's the others. You are the only one. She sighed. Please, I would be honored if you would escort me. Bracton snapped smartly to attention, bowed and offered his arm once more. They walked silently to the stairs and up to the 5th floor, passing by a set of guards. They proceeded to a chamber door. Bracton nodded and smiled at Gerald, who responded with a salute, something Amelia had never seen the guard do before. You are well protected, Bracton remarked. Not me, this is the Empress's chambers. I always check on her before retiring. To be honest, you shouldn't even be on this floor. Then I will take my leave. He started to shift weight, she said, reaching out to touch his arm. Here. She pulled off her scarf and handed it to him. Bracton smiled broadly. I will wear it at the tournament proudly and represent you with honor. Taking her hand, he gently kissed the back of it. Then the knight bowed and left. Amelia's gaze followed him until he reached the stairs and disappeared from sight. When she turned back, she found Gerald grinning. She raised an eyebrow, and the guard wiped the expression from his face. Amelia entered the imperial bed chamber. As always, Medina was at the window, lying on the stone in her thin white nightgown. The Empress looked dead. Amelia found her this way most nights. The mirror was still intact, and Medina was merely asleep. Still, Amelia couldn't help thinking that one day. She pushed the thought away. Medina, she spoke softly as she rocked the Empress's shoulder. Come, it's too cold to lie there. The girl looked up sadly, then nodded. Amelia put her in bed, covered her with a blanket, and gave her a kiss on the forehead. Before leaving Medina to sleep, Adrian was squeezing melted candle wax between his fingers and listening to the rhythmic snores of the Earl, even his. Shadows looked tired, although they were different men since the shift change. He wondered how long he was expected to remain in the great chamber. He saw Sir Brecton return to the grand banquet, but rather than resuming his seat, the valiant warrior struck up a conversation with Nimbus. He watched them for a moment, and then noticed movement at the noble's dais. Daydream's dismay regent soldier picked up his wine goblet and walked directly toward him. "You've done well," the regent said, while taking the seat across from Hadron, or at least it appeared so from over there. "Sentinel Guy and Lord Marius speak highly of you." "Lord Marius? You don't mean Merrick Marius, yes? You remember him, don't you? He was at our little meeting. Oh, how foolish. Perhaps we forgot to introduce him." Mario said he was extremely impressed with the recent assignment that you and your partner performed on his behalf. By the sound of things, it was quite difficult. Even told me that he thought only you could have accomplished such a feat. Adrian clenched his teeth. "I've been thinking, perhaps when this business with Brecton is over, you might find working for the Empire preferable to exile with God. I'm a pragmatist, Adrian, and I can see the benefit of having someone like you aiding in what we are trying to accomplish. I'm sure you've heard any number of terrible things about me, what I may have done, but you need to realize I'm trying to rid our world of problems that plague all of us, commoner and noble alike. Roads have gone to ruin. You can hardly travel in spring due to mud. Banditry is rampant, which hampers trade and stifles prosperity. Every city is a cesspool of filth, and few of adequate fresh water. There are not enough jobs in the north, not enough workers in the south, and not enough food anywhere. Adrian glanced across the great chamber and saw Brecton and Nimbus leaving the grand banquet together. A little while later, Mirthas, Elgar, and Gilbert downed their drinks and left in the same direction. "The world of men has many enemies," Sutter droned on. "When petty kings war with each other, they weaken the nations with their childish feuds. I've long believed these squabbles leave the doors open for invasion and invite destruction. You might not know this, but the Gazelle and the Darker have been raiding from the south. We don't publicize this information, of course, so if you know just how severe it has become. But they have even invaded Tortle 4. Hadrian glared. "If you didn't want the Gazelle as neighbors, you probably shouldn't have invited them." Salda looked at him curiously for a moment, and then said, "I did what was necessary. Now where was I? Oh yes, not everyone can keep what they have. If things are to change, there must be sacrifices. I have tried to be reasonable, but if a leg is infected and cannot be saved, it must be removed for the good of the body. I hope you can see past these small costs and recognize the larger implications. I am not an evil man, Hadron. It is the world that forces me to be cruel, but no more so than a father forcing his child to swallow an unpleasant medicine. You can see that, can't you?" Sutter looked at him expectantly. "Am I allowed to leave?" Adrian asked. "The grand banquet, I mean." Solder sighed and sat back in his chair. "Yes, you can go. You need to get plenty of sleep. The tournament begins in 2 days. Pine cones and holly garland." The remnants of wayward revelers littered the hallways along Hadrian's path to the Knight's Wing. Rounding the corner, he found Nimbus slumped against the corridor wall. The gorgeous tunic was torn and his nose bleeding. Sir Gilbert stood above him grinning. Through the doorway of the common room, Hadrian spotted Sir Brecton, equipped with weapons with only his dress dagger. The valiant warrior defended himself against Martha Sandelga, each of whom wielded a sword as well as a dagger. "Look who's joined the party," Gilbert said as Adrian approached. Given this situation, Adrian asked members while keeping his eyes on Gilbert, "How much generosity am I required to extend to these fellow knights?" In the common room, Martha swiped at Bracton, who caught the sword with his little blade and cast the stroke aside. Given the situation, Nimbus said quickly, "I think the virtue of generosity is not applicable." "Indeed," Bracton shouted. "They are forfeited the right to honorable treatment." Hadron smiled. "That makes this a lot easier." Drawing his own dagger, he threw it into Gilbert's thigh. The knight cried out and fell to his knees. Looking up in astonishment, Adrian punched him in the face, and his opponent collapsed, taking both his and Gilbert's daggers. Adrian advanced. Elgar sneered as he turned to face Hadron, leaving Brexton to Myrthos. "I hope you joust better than you wield a sword," Hadron said, approaching. "We haven't even fought yet." "You fool," Elgar bellowed. "It's hardly necessary. You hold your sword like a woman." "No, that's not true. I've actually known women who can sword fight. The truth is you're just terrible. What I lack in style, I make up for in strength." Elgar charged Hadron, raising his blade over his head and leaving his entire chest exposed. Adrian's training made him instinctively want to aim a single thrust of the man's heart, which would kill Elgar instantly. He fought the urge and lowered his weapon, saldo, and Ethered would not approve. Besides, Elgar was drunk. Instead, he dodged to one side and left a foot behind to trip the knight. Elgar fell, hitting his head on the stone. "Is he dead?" Nimbus asked, watching Hadrian roll the big man over on his bag. "No, but I think he might have chipped the slate." "Now that's a hard head." Adrian sat down next to Nimbus and inspected the tutor's wounds. "Shouldn't you help Subricton?" Adrian glanced up as Myrtha's maid. "Another lunch? I don't think that's necessary. Nor would it be proper to step into another man's fight. However," picking up Elgar's sword, Adrian yelled, "Bracton," before throwing it across the common room. Rectum caught the weapon and Martha stepped back, looking less confident. "Damn you," Martha shouted, taking one last swing before fleeing. Adrian couldn't suppress the temptation to stick out his foot once more, tripping Martha's as he ran by. Martha's fell, got back to his feet, and ran off. "Thank you," Brexton said, offering Hadrian a slight nod. "It's Martha's who should be thanking me," Hadron replied. Brexton smiled. "Indeed. I don't understand," Nimbus said. "Martha's lost. Why would he thank you?" "He's still alive," Adrian explained. "Oh," was all Nimbus said. Adrian managed to stop Nimbus's bleeding. The tutor's nose didn't appear broken. Even so, none of them was interested in returning to the banquet great chamber. Adrian and Braxton escorted Nimbus to his room with a slim man, thanked the two knights for their assistance. "You fight well," Bracton said, as he and Hadrian walked the palace corridors back towards the knight's wing. "Why do they attack you?" "They were drunk. Where I come from, drunk sing badly and sleep with ugly women. They don't attack rival knights and courtly gentlemen." Bracton was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Where do you come from, Sir Adrian?" Sauter explained. "Some of the men that fought with Lord Dumont and survived the clash of Radabaugh joined my army in the north. Captain Lowell was one of them." His accounting of that day in no way resembles the tale Regent Sauter described. "I wouldn't embarrass the Regent or you by mentioning it in public, but now that we're alone." Adrian said nothing. What Lowell did tell me was the entire Imperial army was caught sleeping on that rainy morning. Most never managed to strap on a sword, much less mount a horse, Adrian simply replied. "It was a very confusing day." "So you say, but perhaps you were never there at all. A valiant warrior's taking credit for another's valor is most as honorable. I can assure you I was there," Adrian said sincerely, "and that I rode across the muddy field, leading men into clash that morning." Bracton stopped at the arrival of his own room and studied Hadrian's face. "You must forgive me for my rudeness. You have aided me this evening, and I've responded with accusations. It is unseemly for one knight to accuse another. Without proper evidence, I will not let it happen again. Good night." He offered Hadrian a curt nod and left him alone in the corridor. Chapter 12. The Question of Succession. The sun reached its midday peak, and Arcadius Finarus Latimer, the Master of Law at Sheridan University, still waited in the grand foyer of the Imperial Palace. He'd been there before, but that was back when it had been called Warwick Castle, and had been the home of the most powerful king in Avon. Now it was the seat of the new empire. The imperial seal etched in the white marble floor was a constant and unavoidable reminder. Arcadius read the inscription that ringed the design, shaking his head in disgust. The misspelled honor. He said aloud, even though he waited alone. Finally, a steward approached and motioned for him to follow. "The regent soldier will see you now, sir. One step closer," Arcadius thought as he headed toward the stairs. The steward was nearly to the 4th floor when he realized Arcadius had reached only the 2nd landing. "My apologies," Galore Master called up to him, leaning on the banister and removing his glasses to wipe his brow. "Are you certain the meeting is all the way up there? The regent asked for you to come to his office." The old professor nodded. "Very well, I'll be right along." Another positive development, while it was unlikely that Sauter would agree to his proposal, Arcadius judged his odds of success tripled. With each flight he climbed, he didn't want to speak in a reception great chamber filled with gossipy courtiers. Not that he held much hope, no matter where the subject was broached. Still, if this meeting went well, he would be free of his guilt and the burden of responsibility. A private meeting with the regent would be perfect. Sauter was an intellectual, and Arcadius could appeal to the regent's respect for education. However, when he reached the office, Sauter was not alone. "Well, of course, we need a southern defense," Bethlera was saying when the steward opened the door. "We have a nation of goblins down there. Now you haven't seen them, Sully. You don't know, Yes. What is it?" "May I present Professor Arcadius Latimer, Master of Law at Sheridan University," the steward announced. "Oh yes, the teacher," Catherine said. "He's a bit more than that." Lawless Sauter corrected. "Not at all, not at all," Arcadia said with a cheerful smile. "Instructing young minds is the noblest act I perform." "I am honored." The law master bowed to the 4 people in the room. In addition to the regents, there were 2 men he did not recognize. One, however, was dressed in the distinct vestments of a church sentinel. "You are a long way from Sheridan." Professor Sauter addressed him from behind a large desk. "Did you come for the holiday? I know your grace. At my age, it takes a bit more than the allure of jingling bells and sweetmeats to rouse one, such as I, from warm chambers in the depth of winter. I don't know if you noticed, but there's a great deal of snow outside." Arcadius took a moment to examine his surroundings. Hundreds of books sat on shelves, locked behind glass cabinets with little keyholes. A pretty carpet, somewhat mottled in its colors, and partially hidden by the regent's desk. Portrayed would appear to be a scene of Navran conquering the world while Maribor guided his sword. "Your office is so clean," the professor remarked. Saldo raised an eyebrow and then chuckled. "Oh yes, I seem to recall visiting you once. I don't believe I made it through your door. I have a unique filing system. Lawmaster, I don't mean to be short, but we are quite busy," Ethered said. "Exactly what has brought you so far in the cold?" "Well," he began, grinning at Sauter. "Your Grace, I was hoping to speak to you in private." He glanced pointedly at the 2 men he did not recognize. "I have a sensitive matter to discuss concerning the future of the Empire. This is Sentinel Louise Guy, and over there is Lord Merrick Marius. I assume you already know our soon-to-be Emperor Ethran. If you wish to discuss the Empire's future, these are the men you need to speak with." Arcadius paused deliberately, took off his spectacles, and cleaned them slowly with a sleeve. "Very well then." The Lord Master replaced his glasses and crossed the room to one of the soft chairs. "Do you mind standing for too long? Makes my feet hurt." "By all means," Ethered said sarcastically. "Make yourself at home." Arcadia sat down with a sigh, took a deep breath, and began. "I have been thinking about the new empire you are establishing, And I must say that I approve. Bethel had snorted. Well, Sally, we can sleep better. Now that the scholars have weighed in, Arcadius glared at him from across the tops of his glasses. What I mean is that the idea of a central authority is a sound one, and will stop the monarchical squabbles, bringing harmony from chaos, but Sauter invited. But what I just sense you are going to find fault. Sauter said, I am, but please try not to get ahead of me. It ruins the drama. I spent several days bouncing over frozen ground, preparing for this meeting, and you deserve to experience the full effect. Arcadius adjusted his sleeves and waited for what he thought was the precise amount of time to draw their full attention. I'm curious to know if you've put any thought into the line of succession. Succession, Ethered blurted from where he sat on the edge of Saldo's desk. Yes, you know, the concept of producing an heir to inherit the mantle of leadership. Most thrones are lost because of poor planning. On this front, I'm not even crowned, and you complain because I haven't fathered an heir yet. Arcadius sighed. It's not your heir I am concerned about. This empire is founded on a bedrock of faith that the bloodline of Navran is back on the throne. If the bloodline is not maintained, the cohesion that holds the empire together might dissolve. What are you saying? Catherine asked boldly. That should something tragic happen to Medina, and no child of her blood be available, you would lose your greatest asset. The line of Navran would end, and without this thin strand of legitimacy, the empire would face dissolution. Glen Morgan's empire lasted only 3 generations. How long will this one endure, with only a mere more to let its head? What makes you think anything will happen to the Empress? Arcadius smiled. Let's just say I know the ways of the world, and sacrifices are often required to bring about change. I'm here because I fear you might mistakenly think Medina is expendable once Ethered wears the crown. I want to urge you not to make a terrible, perhaps fatal error. Sauter exchanged looks with Ethered, confirming that the lawmaster had guessed correctly. But there's nothing to fear, gentlemen, for I've come to offer a solution. Arcadius gave them his most disarming smile, which accentuated the laugh lines around his eyes and showed off his round cheeks, which he guessed were still rosy from his trip. I am proposing that Medina already bore a child. What? Catherine asked. He stood and his face showed a mixture of emotions. Are you accusing my fiancée, the Empress, of impropriety? I am saying that if she had a child born a few years ago, and no longer dependent on the mother, it could make your lives a great deal easier. It would ensure the continued unification of the empire under the bloodline of Navran. Speak plainly, man, Effort erupted. Are you suggesting such a child exists? I am saying such a child could exist. He looked at each of their expressions before focusing back on Sauter. Martina is no more the heir of Navran than I am. But that's not relevant. The only thing that matters is what her subjects believe. If they accept she has a child, then the pretense of the heir can continue, and the masses will be satisfied. After ensuring the line of succession, an unfortunate incident involving the Empress wouldn't be such a tragedy. Her people would certainly mourn her, but there would still be hope in the form of a child who would one day take the throne. You bring up an interesting point. Professor Ethered said Medina has been ill as of late, but I'm sure she could hang on long enough to bear a child. Couldn't she, Sully? I don't see why not. Yes, we could arrange that. The lawmaster shook his head, as if hearing an incorrect response from one of his students. But what if she were to die in childbirth? It happens far too often and is too great a risk for something as important as this. Do you really wish to gamble all you are trying to accomplish? A child conceived before the Empress. Even new Ethered wouldn't reflect poorly on him. There are ways to present the child that would bolster the new Emperor's standing. He can profess that his love for Medina is boundless and agree to raise the child as if it were his own. Such sentiments would endear him to the people. Arcadius waited a minute before continuing. Take a healthy child and educate it in philosophy, theology, poetry, history, and mathematics. Fill the vessel with training in civics, economics, and culture. Make the child the most learned leader the world has ever known. Picture the possibilities. Imagine the potential of an empire ruled by an intellectual giant, rather than the thug with the biggest stick. If you want a better empire, you need to create a better ruler. I can provide this. I can bring you a child that I have already begun to educate and will continue to groom. I can raise the child at Sheridan. Away from life at court, we don't want a spoiled brat, pampered from birth, swinging little legs on the imperial throne. What we need is a strong, compassionate leader without ties to the nobility. One you control, Louis Sky accused. Arcadius chuckled. It is true that such a child might be fond of me. And while I know that I caught quite a dashing figure, for someone my age, I'm a very old man. I will be dead soon. Most likely I will pass on long before the child reaches coronation age. So you'll not have to worry about my influence. I should point out that I don't intend to be the child's only tutor, nor could I be in order to ensure success. A task of this magnitude would require historians, doctors, engineers, and even tradesmen. You can send as many of your own instructors as you wish. I would hope you, Regent Soldier, would be one of them. I suspect much of the vision of the new empire comes from you. After all, once the wedding is over and things are operating smoothly, you could join us at Sheridan. She require training that you are uniquely qualified to teach. She, Atherin said. Beg pardon? Arcadius asked, peering over his glasses again. You said she. Are you speaking of a girl? Well, yes. The child I am suggesting is a young orphan, whom I've been taken care of for some time. She's extremely bright, and at the age of 5 has already mastered letters. She's a delightful girl who shows great promise. Mask a girl ever had sneered. What good is a girl? I'm afraid my fellow regent is correct, Sadr said. The moment she married, her husband would rule, and all your education would be wasted if it was a boy. Well, there's no shortage of orphan boys. After a declared, find a handsome one, and we can do the same with him. My offer is for this girl only. Why? Guy asked. Arcadius detected a tone, and a question he did not like. Because I sense in her the makings of a magnificent ruler, the kind who could, but she's a girl, Bethel Good repeated, as is Empress Medina. Are you saying you would refuse to tutor another child? One of our choosing, Sadr asked. Yes, Arcadia said the word, with the stern conviction of an ultimatum. He hoped the value of knowledge that only he could bestow would be enough to win them over. But he could see the answer before it was spoken. Sadr was respectful at least, and politely thanked him for bringing the subject to their attention. They didn't invite him to stay for wintertide, and Arcadius was uncomfortable. By the way, Louis Sky watched him as he left. He had failed. Royce waited patiently. He had been in Imperial Square that morning, speaking with vendors, who regularly delivered supplies to the palace, when the old battered coach passed by and entered the Imperial gates, recognizing it immediately. Royce wondered what it was doing there. The palace courtyard had insufficient space for all the visitors, carriages during wintertide, and soon the coach returned and parked along the outer wall. The old buggy with its paint-chipped wheels, weathered sides, and tattered drapes looked out of place amidst the line of noble vehicles. He waited for what must have been hours before he spotted the old man leaving the palace and approaching the carriage. What the Arcadias began, he was startled by. Royce, who sat inside, the thief placed a finger to his lips. What are you doing here? Arcadius whispered, pulling himself in and closing the door behind him. Waiting to ask you that same question, Royce said quietly. Where to, Professor? The driver called as he climbed aboard. The coach bounced with his weight. Just circle the city once. Will you? Just in the city, sir. Yes, I'd like to see it before we leave. Certainly, sir. Well, Royce pressed as the carriage jerked forward. Chancellor Lambert took sick on the day. He was to leave for the celebrations here because he could not attend. He thought a personal apology was required and asked me, of all people, to deliver his regrets. Now what about you? We located the heir. Teach you now. Yeah, and you said finding him would be difficult. Royce drew back his hood and tugged his gloves off. One finger at a time, after Hadrian discovered he was the guardian of the heir, he knew exactly what he wanted for a winter-tight present. His very own heir of Navran. And where is this mythical chimera? Right underfoot, as it turns out. We're still pinpointing him. But best guess puts gone to the palace dungeons. He is being held for execution on the tide. We were planning to steal him before that. The heir is Degan Gonet. Ironic, huh? The nationalist leader trying to overthrow the empire is actually the one man destined to rule it. You said were. So you're not planning to rescue him anymore? No, Adrian cut some deal with the regions. They've made him a valiant warrior of all things. If he wins the joust, I think they promise to set Gaunt free. I'm not sure I trust them though. The carriage rolled through the streets and up a hill, causing the horse to slow its pace. One of Arcadius's open travel bundles fell to the floor, joining the rest of his clothes, a pile of books, his shoes, and a mount of blankets. Have you ever put anything away in your life? Voice asked. Never saw the point. I just have to take it back out again. So Hadrian's in the palace, but what are you doing here? I heard Medford was burned. Shouldn't you be checking on Gwen? Already have. She's fine and staying at the Wines Abbey. That reminds me, you might want to stick around. If all goes well, you can come with us. For the wedding. Who's mine? I finally asked Gwen, and she agreed. Believe it or not. Did she? Arcadia said, reaching out for one of the blankets to draw over his legs. Yeah. And here we both thought she had more sense than that. Can you picture me as a husband and a father? Father, you've discussed children. She wants them and even picked out names. Has she now? And how does that sit with you? Whining children and stagnation might be harder for you than all the challenges you faced before. And this is one you can't walk out on. If you decide it's not for you, the old man tilted his head to look over the tops of his glasses, his mouth slightly open. Are you sure that's what you want? You've been after me to find a good woman for years. Now you're second-guessing, Gwen. I know I won't find better. Oh no, it's not that. I just know your nature. I'm not sure you'll be content with the role of a family man. Are you trying to scare me off? I thought you wanted me to settle down. Besides, when you found me, I was a much different person. I remember the wizard said thoughtfully, you are like a rabid dog, snapping at everything and everyone. Clearly, my genius in matching you up with Adrian worked wonders. I knew his noble heart would eventually soften yours. Yeah, well, travel with a guy long enough, and you start picking up his bad habits. You've no idea how many times I almost killed him. When we first started, I never bothered because I expected the jobs would take care of that for me, but somehow he kept surviving. Well, I'm glad to see things worked out for you both. Gwen is a fine woman, and you're right. You couldn't do better, so you'll wait. I'm afraid not. I was ordered to return immediately. But you'll come out to the Wines Abbey afterward, right? If you were not there, it would be like not having my farewell. Dead uncle, at least. Arcadia smiled, but it looked strained. After a moment of silence, the smile disappeared. What's wrong? Voice asked. Oh, nothing. No, I've seen that look before. What is it, you old coot? Oh, well, probably nothing. Arcadia said. Out with it. I was just in with the regions. With them were a sentinel named New East Sky, and another very quiet fellow. I've never seen him before, but the name was familiar. You're used to speak of him often. Who? They introduced him as Lord Merrick Marius. Chapter 13. The House on Heath Street. Mince was freezing. The dawn's wind ripped through the course woven bag around his shoulders, as if it were a fishnet. His nose ran, his ears were frozen, his once numb fingers now stuffed in his armpits burned. He managed to escape most of the heavy gusts by standing in the recessed doorway of a military shop, but his feet were lost in a deep snow drift, protected only by double wraps of cloth. Stuffed with straw, it would be worth it if you learned who lived in the house across the street, and if that name matched the one the hooded stranger had asked about. Mr. Grimm, or was it Mr. Baldwin, had promised 5 silver to the boy who found the man he was looking for, given the flood of strangers in town. It was a tall order to find a single man, but Mintz knew his city well. Mr. Grimm it had to be. Mr. Grimm explained the fellow would be a smart guy who visited the palace a lot. That, right there, told Mintz to head to the Hill District. Elbright was checking out the inns, and Brand was watching the palace gate. But Mintz was sure Heath Street was the place. For someone with palace connections, Mintz looked at the house across the street. Only 2 stories and quite narrow, it was tucked tight between 2 others, not as fancy as the big homes, but still a fine place. Built entirely of stone, it had several glass windows, the kind you could actually see through. Most of the houses on Heath Street were that way. The only distinguishing marks on this one were the dagger and oak leaf embossed above the door, and a noticeable lack of any wintertide decoration. While the rest of the homes were the decked-in streamers and ropes of garland, the little house was bare. It used to belong to Lord Demond, who had died in the clash of Radipor the past summer. Mintz asked the kids who begged on the street if they knew who owned it now. All they could tell him was that the master of the house rode in a fine carriage with an imperial uniformed driver and had 3 servants. Both the master and the servants kept to themselves, and all were new to Equester. This has to be the right house. Mintz muttered his words, forming a little cloud. A lot was riding on him that morning. He had to be the one to win the money for kindness' sake. Mintz had been on his own since he was 6. Handouts were easy to come by at that age. But with each year things got tougher. There was a lot of competition in the city, especially now with all the refugees. Elbright, Brand and Kane were the ones who kept him alive. Elbright had a knife and Brand had killed another kid in a fight over a tunic. It made others think twice before messing with them. But it was Kane. The master pickpocket was his best friend. Kinney had taken sick a few weeks earlier. He began throwing up and sweating like it was summer. They each gave him some of their food, but he wasn't getting better for the past 3 days. He hadn't even been able to leave the nest. Each time men saw him, kind looked worse, whiter, thinner, blushier and shivering, always shivering. Elbright had seen this sickness before and said not to waste any more food on Kind. As he was as good as dead, Min still shared a bit of his bread, but his friend rarely ate it. He hardly ate anything anymore. Mintz crossed the street to the front of the house, and to escape the bitter wind, he slipped to the right of the porch stairs. His foot sank deeper than expected, and his arms windmilled as he fell down a short flight of steps leading to a root cellar. Mintz landed on his back, sending up a cloud of powder that blinded him. He reached around and felt a hinge. His frozen hands continued to search and found a large lock holding the door fast. He stood and dusted himself off. As he did, he noticed a gap under the stairs, a drain of some kind. His fall had uncovered the opening. Hearing the approach of the butcher's wagon, he quickly slithered inside. "What will you have today, sir?" "Goose, no beef, no pork. Tomorrow starts blood week, so I'll wait. I have some right tasty pigeons and a couple of quail." "I'll take the quail, you can keep the pigeons." Men's hadn't eaten since the previous morning, and all their speak about food reminded his stomach. "Very good, Mr. Jenkins. Are you sure you don't require anything else?" "Yes, I'm sure that will be all." Jenkins means, thought that's probably the servant's name, not the master of the house. Footfalls came down the steps. and Mence held his breath as the manservant brushed the snow away from the cellar door with a broom. He opened it to allow the butcher entry. "It's freezing out here," Jenkins muttered and trotted out of sight. "That it is, sir, that it is." The butcher's boy carried the goose, already plucked, and beheaded down into the cellar, and then returned to the wagon for the quails. The door was open. It might have been the cold, the hunger, or the thought of 5 silver, most likely. It was all three that sent men scurrying inside, quick as a ferret, without bothering to consider his decision. He scrambled behind a pile of sacks that smelled of potatoes and crouched low while trying to catch his breath. The butcher's boy returned, with the scavenger creatures hung by their feet, and stepped out again. The door slammed and Mence heard the lock snap shut. After the brilliant world of sun and snow, Mence was blind. He stayed still and listened. The footsteps of the manservant crossed overhead, but they soon faded and everything was quiet. The boy knew there was no way to escape the cellar undetected, but he chose not to worry about that. The next time there was delivery, he would just make a run for it. He could get through the door on surprise, and no one could catch him once he was in the open. When Mence looked around again, he noticed that he could see. As his eyes adjusted to the light filtering down through gaps in the boards, the cellar was cool, although balmy when compared to the street, and filled with crates, sacks, and jugs. Sides of bacon hung from the ceiling. A small box lined with straw held more eggs than he could count. Mence cracked one of them over his mouth and swallowed. Finding a tin of milk, he took 2 big mouthfuls and got mostly cream. Thick and sweet, it left him grinning with delight. Looking at all the containers, Mence felt as if he had fallen into a treasure room. He could live there by hiding in the piles, sleeping in the sacks, and eating himself fat, hunting through the shelves for more treats. Mence found a jar of molasses and was trying to get the lid off when he heard steps overhead, muffled. Voices were coming closer. "I will be at the palace the rest of the day. I'll have the carriage brought at once, my lord. I want you and Poe to take this medallion to the silversmith. Get him started making a duplicate. Don't leave it, and don't let it out of your sight. Stay with him and watch over it. It is extremely valuable." "Yes, my lord, and bring it back at the end of the day. I expect you'll need to take it over several times, but your dinner, my lord." "Surely, Mr. Pokin, I'll get my meals at the palace. I'm not trusting Poe with this. He's going along only as protection." "But my lord, he's hardly more than a boy." "Never mind that, just do as instructed." "Where is Dobbs?" "Cleaning the bedrooms, I believe." "Take him too, you'll be gone all day. And I don't want him left here alone." "Yes, my lord, my lord, my lord." Mence was ready to scream in frustration. Why not just use the bugger's name? Mence listened for a long time. Before deciding the house was empty, he crossed the cellar, climbed to the steps, and tried the door to the house. It opened, careful and quiet as a mouse. He crept out aboard Creek 20, put his weight on it. He froze in terror, but nothing happened. He was alone in the kitchen. Food was everywhere: bread, pickles, eggs, cheese, smoked meats, and honey. Mence sampled each one as he passed. He'd eaten bread before, but this was soft and creamy compared to the 3-day-old biscuits he was used to. The pickles were spicy, the cheese was a delight, and the meat, despite being tough from curing, was a delicacy he rarely knew. He also found a small barrel of beer that was the best he had ever had. Mence found himself lightheaded and stuffed as he left the kitchen with a slice of pie in one hand, a wedge of cheese in the other, and a stringy strip of meat in his pocket. The inside of the house was more impressive than the exterior. Sculptured plaster carved wood, finely woven tapestries, and silk curtains lined the walls. A fire burned in the main room. Logs softly crackled, the warmth spreading throughout the lower floor. Crystal glasses sat inside cherry cabinets. Fat candles and statuettes rested on tables, and books filled the shelves. Men's had never held a book before. He finished the pie, stuffed the cheese in his other pocket, and then pulled one down. The book was thick and heavier than he had expected. He tried to open it, but it slipped through his greasy fingers and struck the floor. With a heavy thud that echoed through the house, he froze, held his breath, and waited for footsteps or a shout. Silence. Picking up the book, he felt the raised to leather spine and marveled off the gold letters on the cover. He imagined the words revealed some powerful magic, a secret that could make men rich or grant eternal life. Setting the book back on the shelf, with a bit of sadness, Mens moved toward the stairs. He climbed to the second story, where there were several bedrooms. The largest had an adjoining study with a desk and more books. On the desk were parchments. More mysterious words, more secrets. He picked up one of the pages, turned it sideways, and then upside down, as if a different orientation might force the letters to reveal their mysteries. He grew frustrated, dropping the page back on the desk. He started to leave when a light caught his attention. A strange glow came from within the wardrobe. He stared at it for a long time before venturing to open the door. Vests, tunics, and cloaks filled the cabinet. Pushed to the rear was a robe that shimmered with its own light. Mesmerized, Mintz risked a hesitant touch. The material was unlike anything he had felt before. Smoother than a polished stone and softer than a down feather. The moment he touched the fabric, the garment instantly changed from dark, shimmering silver to an alluring purple, and glowed the brightest where his fingers contacted it. Mens glanced nervously around the room. He was still alone. On an impulse, it pulled the robe out. The hem brushed the floor, and he immediately draped it over his arm. Letting the robe touch the ground didn't seem right. He started to put it on, and had one arm in the sleeve when he stopped. The robe felt cold, and it turned dark blue, almost black. When he pulled his arm out, the beautiful purple glow returned. Mintz reminded himself he was not there to steal. On principle, he wasn't against thieving. He stole all the time. He picked pockets, grabbed and ran from markets, and even looted drunks, but he had never robbed a house, certainly not a Heath Street house. Thieving from nobles was dangerous, and the authorities were the least of his worries. If the Thieves' Guild found out, their punishment would be worse than anything the magistrate would come up with. No one would raise a stink over a starving boy taking food, but the robe was a different matter. With all the books and writing in the house, it was obvious the owner was a wizard, a warlock of some sort. It was too risky. What would I do with it anyway? While it would put old Bran the Bold's tunic to shame, he could never put it on. The robe was too big for him to wear, and Mintz wouldn't dare cut it, even if he managed it. The robe would draw every eye in the city. He reached out to put it back in the wardrobe, deciding he couldn't risk taking it. Once more the robe went dark, still holding it. He pulled his arm and it glowed. Again, puzzled but still determined, Mintz hung it back up. The moment he let go, the robe fell to the floor. He tried again, and it fell once more. "All right, go ahead and stay there," he said, and started to shift away. The robe instantly flared to a brilliant white. All shadows in the room vanished, and men staggered backwards, squinting to see. Okay, stop it," he shouted. The light dimmed to blue again. Mintz didn't move. He stood, staring at the robe as it lay on the floor. The light was throbbing, growing bright and dim, almost as if it were breathing. He watched it for several minutes, trying to figure it out. Slowly he stepped closer and picked it up. "You want me to take you?" The robe glowed the pretty purple color. "Can I wear you dark blue?" "So you just want me to steal you?" "Purple, don't you belong here?" "Blue, you're being held against your will." The robe flashed purple, so brightly that it made him blink. "You're not, you know. Cursed are you. You're not going to hurt me, are you?" "Blue, is it okay if I fold you up and stuff you inside my tunic?" "Purple, as big as it was the garment compressed easily. Mint stuffed it in the top of his shirt, making him look like a busty girl. Because he was already stealing the robe, he also picked up a handful of parchments and stuffed them in as well. He wasn't going to find out who lived there while the occupants were out, and Means didn't want to stick around for them to discover that the robe was missing. Mr. Grimm looked to be the type to know letters or know someone who did. Maybe he could tell enough from the parchments for Mintz to win the silver. Royce sat on the bleachers in Imperial Square, observing the patterns of the city. Wintertide was less than 2 weeks away, and the city swelled with pilgrims. They filled the plaza, bustled by the street vendors and open shops, and shouted holiday greetings and obscenities in equal measure. Wealthy blanket-wrapped merchants rode in carriages, pointing at the various sights. Visiting tradesmen carried tools over their shoulders, open to pick up work, while established vendors scowled at them. Bread-bear farmers and peasants visiting Equester to see the Holy Empress huddled in groups, staring in awe of their surroundings. Betrayal in Medford. Royce read the sign posted in front of a small theater. It indicated nightly performances during the week, leading up to Wintertide's Eve, from the barkers on the street. He determined the play was the imperial variation of the popular, the crown conspiracy which the empire had outlawed. Apparently in this version, the plotting prince and his witch sister decide to murder their father, and only the good Archduke stands in the way of their evil plans. For patrols of 8 men circled the streets. At least one group checked in at each square every hour. They were swift and harsh in their peacekeeping. Dressed in mail and bearing heavy weapons, they brutally beat and dragged away anyone causing a nuisance or being accused of a crime. They didn't bother to hear the suspect side of the story. They didn't care who had trespassed on whom, or whether the accusation was truth or fiction. Their goal was order, not justice. An interesting side effect, which would have been comical if the results had not been so ugly, was that street vendors falsely accused their out-of-town competitors of offenses. Local vendors banded together, forming an alliance to denounce the upstarts. Before long, people learned to gather at the squares, just before an imperial patrol was expected to arrive, or follow the men. As they patrolled, the spectacle of violence was just one more holiday show to good-sized pigs, attempting to escape their fates of Blood Week. Ran through the square trailed by a parade of children and to mongrel dogs chasing after them. A butcher wearing a blood-stained apron and looking exhausted from running paused to wipe his brow. Royce spotted the boy, deftly dodging his way through the crowd, pausing briefly to avoid the train. Chasing the pig, Mentz locked eyes with Royce, then casually strolled over to the bleachers. Royce was pleased to see no one watched the boy's progress too closely. "Looking for me?" Royce asked. "Yes, sir," Mentz replied. "You found him?" "Don't know, maybe never got a name or a look. Got these though." The boy pulled some parchments from his shirt. "I snatched him from a house on Heath Street. It has a new owner. Can you read?" Royce ignored the question. As he scanned the parchments, the handwriting was unmistakable. He slipped them into his cloak. "Where exactly is this house?" Mentz smiled. "I'm right. Art I do I get the coin. Where's the house?" "Heath Street south off the top, harbor side. Little place right across from Buchan's Hattery. You can't miss it. There's a crest of an oak leaf and dagger above the door." "Now what about the money?" Royce didn't respond, but focused on the boy's overstuffed tunic, which glowed as if he had a star trapped inside. Mentz saw his look and promptly folded his arms. Tilting his head down, he whispered, "Quit it. Did you take something else from the house?" Mentz shook his head. "It has nothing to do with you. If it's from the same house, you'll want to give it to me." Mentz stuck his lip out defiantly. "It's nothing and it's mine. I'm a thief, see? I took it for myself in case I got the wrong house. I didn't want to risk my neck and get nothing, so it's my bonus." That's how professional these work. See, you might not like it, but it's how we do things. You and me had a deal, and I've done my part. Don't get all high and mighty or go on about bad morals. 'Cause I get enough of that from the monks. The light grew brighter and began flashing on and off. Voice was disturbed. What is that? Like I said, it's none of your business. Ment snapped and pulled away. He looked down once more and whispered, "Stop it, will ya? People can see or get in predicament. Listen, I don't have a problem with a little theft." Royce told him, "You can trust me on that. But if you took something of value from that house, you'd be wise to give it to me. This might sound like a trick, but I'm only trying to help. You don't understand who you're dealing with. The owner will find you. He's very meticulous." What's that mean, meticulous? Let's just say he's not a forgiving man. He will kill you outright and bland. Not to mention anyone else you regular contact with. Just to be thorough, I'm keeping it. Ment snapped. Royce rolled his eyes inside. The boy struggled to cover up by doubling over and wrapping his arms around his chest. As he did, the light blinked faster and now alternated different colors. By March, just give me the money. Will you, before one of the guards sees? Royce handed him 5 silver coins and watched as the boy took off. He ran hunched over, emitting a rapidly blinking light that faded and eventually stopped. Ment entered the loft by climbing to the roof of the warehouse, pulling back a loose board near the eaves, and scrambling through the hole. The nest, as they dubbed their home, was the result of poor carpentry, a mistake made when the East Sundries Company had built their warehouse. Against the common wall of the Bingham carriage house and blacksmith shop, a mismeasurement had left a gap, which was sealed shut with sideboards. Over the years, the wood had warped. While trying to break into the warehouse, Albright had noticed a gap between the boards that revealed the hidden space. He never found a way into the storehouse, but he discovered the perfect hideout. The little attic was 3 feet tall and 5 feet wide, and ran the length of the common wall, thanks to the long hours of the blacksmiths, who usually kept a fire burning. It was also marginally heated. A collection of treasures, gathered from the city's garbage, littered the nest, including moth-eaten garments, burned bits of lumber, fragments of hides tossed out by the tanner, cracked pots and chipped cups. Kind lay huddled in a ball against the chimney. Mints had made him a bed of straw and tucked their best blanket around him, but his friends still shivered. The little bit of his face not covered by the blanket was pale white, and his bluish lips quivered miserably. "How you doing?" Mints asked. Cold Kinney replied weakly. Mints put a hand to the brick chimney. "Bastards are trying to save coal again. Is there any food?" Kind asked. Mints pulled the wedge of cheese from his pocket. Kind took a bite and immediately started to vomit. Nothing came up, but he, wretched just the same. He continued to convulse for several minutes, then collapsed, exhausted. "I'm like Timothy, ain't I?" Kind managed to say no. Men slid sitting down beside him. He hoped to keep Kind warm with his body. "You'll be fine the moment the fire is lit, you'll see." Men's fished the money out of his other pocket to show. Kind, "Hey look, I got coin 5 silver, I could buy you a hot meal." "How would that be?" "Don't," Kind replied. "Don't waste it." "What do you mean? When is a hot soup ever a waste?" "I'm like Tibbeth, soup won't help." "I told you you're not like that." Mints insisted, slamming the silver in a cup he decided at that moment to use as a bank. "I can't feel my feet anymore, Mints, and my hands tingle. Ike all over and my head pounds and end. I pissed myself today. Did you hear me? I pissed myself. I am like Timot. I'm just like he was, and I'm gonna die just like him. I said you ain't now, quit it. My lips are blue, ain't they?" "Be quiet, Kind, just pie Mom." "Mints, I don't want to die." Kind shook even more as he cried. Men's felt a stomach churn as tears dripped down his cheeks. 2 victims never recovered once their lips went blue. He looked around for something else to wrap his friend in, and then remembered the robe. There, he muttered, draping the robe of a kind through all the predicament you've been. Try to be of some use. Keep him warm or I'll toss you in the smith's fire. What kind moaned, nothing, go to sleep. Royce heard the key shift, the bolts shifted, and the door opened on well-oiled hinges. 4 pairs of feet shuffled on the slate of the foyer. He heard the sound of the door closing, the brush of material, and the snap of a cloak. 1 pair of feet scuffed abruptly, as if their owner unexpectedly found himself on the edge of a precipice. Mr. Jenkins. Merrick's voice said, I want you and Dobbs to take the rest of the evening off. But sir, this is no time to argue. Please, Mr. Jenkins, just leave. Hopefully I'll see you in the morning. Hopefully. This voice was familiar. Royce recognized Poe, the cook's mate on the Emerald Storm. It took him a moment, but then Royce understood. What do you mean you will hold on? Is he here? How do you know? I want you to go to Poe. Not if he's here. You'll need protection. If you wanted me dead, I would already be lying in a bloody puddle. So I think it's fair to surmise that I'm safe. You, on the other hand, are a different story. I doubt he knew you would be here. Now that he knows your connection to me, the only thing keeping you alive is that he is more interested in talking to me than spitting your throat, at least for the moment. Let him try, I think, Poe. Leave the thinking to me and never tempt him like that. This is not a man to toy with. Trust me, he'd kill you without difficulty. I know. I worked with him. We specialized in assassinations. And he's better at it than I am, particularly spur-of-the-moment killings. And right now you're a very tempting spur. Now get out while you can. Disappear for a while just to be safe. What makes you think he even knows I'm here? Go ask. He's in the drawing room listening to us right now, sitting in the blue chair with its back to the wall. He's waiting for me to join him. I'm sure he has a crystal glass, half filled with the Monte Morsi wine I bought and left in the pantry for him. He's holding it in his left hand. So for whatever reason he has to draw his dagger. He won't need to put the glass down first. He hates to waste Monte Morsi. He's swirling it, letting it breathe while he's been here for some time. He has yet to taste it. He won't drink until I sit across from him, until I have a glass. He suspects you poisoned it. No, he hasn't tasted the wine because, well, it would just be impolite. He had a glass of cider waiting for me, as he knows I no longer drink spirit. How do you know all this? Because I know him just as I know you, right now. You're fighting an urge to enter the drawing room, to see if I'm right. Don't. You'll never come out again, and I don't want you staining my new carpet. Now leave. I'll contact you when I need to. Are you sure? Yeah, okay, stupid question. The door opened then closed, and footsteps could be heard. Going down the porch stairs, there was a pause and then a light flared. Merrick Marius entered the dark room, holding a single candle. I hope you don't mind. I prefer to be able to see you two. Merrick lit for sconce lights, added some logs to the fire, and stirred the embers to life with a poker. He watched them for a long moment, then placed the tool back on its hook, before taking a seat opposite Royce, next to the poured glass of cider. To old friends, Merrick asked, holding up his drink. 2 old friends, Royce agreed, and the two sipped. Merrick was dressed in a knee-length coat of burgundy, velvet, a finely embroidered vest, and a startlingly white ruffled shirt. You're doing well for yourself, Royce observed. I can't complain. I'm magistrate of Calora now. Have you heard? I hadn't. Your father would be proud. He said I couldn't do it. Do you remember? He said I was too smart for my own good. Merrick took another sip. I suppose you're angry about Torto for. You crossed a line. I know. I am sorry about that. You were the only one who could do that job. If I could have found someone else. Merrick crossed his legs and looked over his glass at Royce. You're not here to kill me, so I'll assume your visit is about Hadrian. Is that you're doing this deal? Merrick shook his head. Actually, Guy came up with that. They tried to persuade Hadrian to kill Brexton. from money and a title. My only contribution was providing the proper incentive. They're dangling God, Royce asked. Merrick nodded. And the Witch of Melanger, Arista, when did they get her? A few months ago. She and her bodyguard tried to free Gond. He died and she was captured. Royce took another drink and then set his glass down before asking, "They're going to kill Hedron, aren't they?" "Yes, the Regions know they can't just let him go. After he kills Brexton, they'll arrest him for murder, throw him in prison and execute him along with Gorn to Darista on Wintertide. Why do they want Brexton dead? They offered him Melanger in order to separate him from Valentine. He refused, and now they're afraid the Earl of Chadwick will attempt to use Brexton to overthrow the Empire. They're spooked and feel their only chance to eliminate him is by using a Tesla-trained warrior. Nice skills to having a partner. By the way, good choice." Royce sipped his wine and thought a while. "Can you save him?" Hadrian Merrick paused and then answered, "Yes." The word hung there. "What do you want?" Royce said, "Interesting that you should ask. As it turns out, I have another job that you would be perfect for." "What kind?" "Find and recover. I can't give you the details yet, but it's dangerous. 2 other groups have already failed. Of course, I wasn't involved in those attempts. And you weren't leading the operation. Agree to take the job, and I'll make sure nothing happens to Adrian." "I've retired. I heard that rumor." Royce drained his glass and stood. "I'll think about it. Don't wait too long, Royce. If you want me to work this, I'll need a couple of days to prepare. Trust me, you want my help. A dungeon rescue will fail." The prison is dwarven made. Chapter 14, Tournament Day. Dawn to the wails and cries of the doomed. The snow ran red as axe and mallets slaughtered livestock whose feed had run out. Blood Week happened every winter, but exactly what day it began depended on the bounty of the fall harvest. For an orphan and a quester, the best part of winter was Blood Week. Nothing went to waste: feet, snouts, and even bones sold, but with so much to cleave, butchers couldn't keep track of every cut. The city's poor circled the butcher shops like human vultures, searching for an inattentive cutter. Most butchers hired extra help, but they always underestimated the dangers. There were never enough arms bearing the meat to safety, or enough eyes keeping lookout. A few daring raids even managed to carry off whole legs of beef. As the day wore on and workers grew exhausted, some desperate butchers resorted to hiring the very thieves they guarded against. Mintz had left the nest early, looking for what he could scrounge for breakfast. The sun had barely peaked above the city wall when he managed to snatch a fine bit of beef from Gillam's slaughterhouse. After a particularly sound stroke from Gillam's cleaver, a piece of shank skipped across the slick table, fell in the snow, and slid downhill. Mintz happened to be in the right place. At the right time, he snatched it and ran, with the bloody, fist-sized chunk of meat clutched inside his tunic. Anyone noticing the sprinting boy might conclude he was mortally wounded. He was anxious to devour his prize, but exposing it would risk losing the meat to a bigger kid. Were she at a butcher or guard might spot him. Mintz wished Brand and Albright were with him. They had gone to the slaughterhouses down on Coswell, where most of the butchering would be done. The fights there would be fierce. Grown men would struggle for scraps. Alongside the orphans, Menz was too small to compete. Even if he managed to grab a hunk, someone would likely take it, beating him senseless. The other 2 boys could hold their own. Albright was as tall as most men now, and Brand even larger, but Menz had to satisfy himself with the smaller butcher shops arriving on the street. In front of the Bingham carriage house, Menz stopped. He needed to get inside, but the thought of what he might find there frightened him. In his haste to get an early start, he'd forgotten about Kind for the past few days. His friend's loud wheezing had frequently woken Mintz, but he couldn't remember having heard anything. That morning, Menz had seen too much death. He knew 8 boys friends who died from cold, sickness, or starvation. They always went in winter, their bodies stiff and frozen. Each lifeless form had once been a person laughing, joking, running, crying, then was just a thing, like a torn blanket or a broken lantern. After finding remains, men would drag them to the pile. There was always a pile in winter, no matter how short a distance. He needed to drag the body. The trip felt like miles. He remembered the good times and the moments they had spent together. Then he would look down at the stiff, pale thing. Will I be the thing one day? Will someone drag me to the pile? He gritted his teeth, entered the alley, climbed to the roof, and pulled back the board. Leaving the brilliant sunlight, Mince crawled blindly into the crevice. The nest was dark and silent. There was no sound of breathing. Wheezing or otherwise, Mince reached forward, imagining Kind's cold, stiff body. The thought caused his hand to shake, even as he wheeled his fingers to spread out, searching. Touching the silken material of the robe, he recoiled as it began to glow. Kane was not there. The robe lay on the floor, as if Kind had melted during the night. Mince pulled the material toward him. As he did, the glow increased, enough to reach every corner of the room. He was alone. Kind was gone. Not even his body remained. Mince sat for a second, and then a thought surfaced. He dropped the robe in horror and kicked it away. The robe's glow throbbed and grew fainter. You ate him, Mince cried. You lied to me, you are cursed. The lights went out, and Mince backed to as far away as possible. He had to get away from the killer robe. But now it was lying between him and the exit. A silhouette passed in front of the opening, momentarily blocking the sunlight. Mince, Kind's voice said. Mince, look, I got me lamb chops. Kinney entered and replaced the board. Mince's eyes adjusted until he could see his friend, holding a pair of bloody bones. His chin was stained red. I would have saved you one, but I couldn't find you. By my, I was famished. You all right, Kind? I'm great. I'm still a little hungry, but other than that I feel fantastic. But last night, men started last night, yeah, didn't look so good. Kind nodded. By all kinds of queer dreams, that's for sure. What kind of dreams? Oh, just old stuff. I was drowning in this dark lake. I couldn't breathe. Cause water was spilling into my mouth every time I tried to take a breath. I tried to swim, but my arms and legs barely moved. It was a terrible nightmare. Kind noticed the beef shank men still held. Hey, you got some meat too? You wanna cock it up? I'm still hungry. Oh sure, Men said, as he looked down at the robe, while handing the beef to Kinney. I love Blood Week, don't you? Trumpets blared and drums rolled as the pennants of 27 noble hazards snapped. In the late morning breeze, people filed into the stands at High Court Fields. On the opening day of the Grand Avon Wintertide Tournament, the contest would last 10 days, ending with a grand banquet of tides. Across the city, shops closed and work stopped. Only the smoking and salting of meat continued, as Blood Week ran parallel to the tournament, and the slaughter couldn't halt, even for such an august event. Many thought the timing was an omen that signaled the games would produce a higher number of accidents, which only added to the excitement. Every year, crowds delighted in seeing blood. 2 years before, the Baron Linder of Maragnon had died, when a splintered lance held by Sir Gilbert pierced the visor of Isham. The same year, Sir Dulner of Renyard had his right hand severed in the final round of the sword competition. Nothing, however, compared to the showdown 5 years ago between Sir Gervas and Francis Stanley, the Earl of Harburn. In the final tilt of the tournament, Sir Gervas, who had already borne a grudge against the Earl, passed over the traditional lance of peace and picked up the lance of war against counsel. The Earl agreed to the deadly challenge. Jarvis's lance pierced Stanley's cuirass as if it were parchment and continued on through his opponent's chest. The valiant warrior didn't escape the encounter unscathed. Stanley's lance pierced Jarvis's helm and entered his eye socket. Both fell dead. Officials judged the Earl the victor. due to the extra point for a head blow centuries earlier. High court fields had functioned as the supreme, noble court of law on Avron. Civil disputes inevitably escalated, until accused and accuser turned to combat, to determine who was right. Soon the only dispute became who was the best warrior. As the realms of Avron expanded, trips to high court became less convenient. Monthly sessions were eventually reduced to bi-yearly events, where all grievances were settled over a 2-week session. These were held on the holy days of summer's rule and wintertide in the belief. Maribor was more attentive at these times. Over the years the celebration grew, instead of merely proving their honor. The combatants also fought for glory and gold. Knights from across the nation came to face each other for the most prestigious honor in Avron, champion of the high court games, adorned in the distinct colors of their owners. Richly decorated tents of the noble, competitors clustered around the fringe of the fields. Squires, grooms, and pages polished armor and brushed the lord's horses. Knights entered in the sword competition, limbered up with blades and shields, sparring with their squires. Officials walked the line of the carousel, a series of posts, dangling steel rings no larger than a man's fist. They measured the height of each post and the angle of each ring, which men on galloping horses would try to collect. With lancers, archers took practice shots. Spearmen sprinted and lunged, testing the sand's traction on the great jousting field. Horses snorted and huffed as unarmored combatants took practice rides. Across the course, amidst all this activity, Adrian braced himself against the post as Wilbur beat on his chest with a large hammer. Nimbus had arranged for the smith to adjust Hadrian's borrowed armor. Obtaining a suit was simple, but making it fit properly was another matter. "Here, sir," Renwick said, holding out a pile of cloth to Adrian. "What's that for?" Adrian asked. Renwick looked at them curiously. "It's your padding, sir." "Don't hand it to him, lad," Wilbur scolded. "Stuff it in." Embarrassment flooded the boy's face as he began wadding up the cloth and shoving it into the wide gap between the steel and Hadrian's tunic. "Pack it tight," Wilbur snapped. He took a handful of padding and stuffed it against Adrian's chest, ramming it in. "Hard, that's a bit too tight," Adrian complained. Wilbur gave him a sidelong glance. "You might not think that. When some Earth's lance hits you, I don't want to be accused of bad preparation, because this boy failed to pack you properly." So Adrian, when work began, "I was thinking, would it be all right if I were to enter the Squire events? Don't see why not. Are you any good?" "No, but I would like to try just the same." So Malnus never allowed it. He didn't want me to embarrass him. "Are you really that bad?" "I've never been allowed to train." So Malnus forbid me from using his horse. He was fond of saying a man upon a horse has a certain way of looking at the world, and a lad such as yourself should not get accustomed to the experience, as it will only produce disappointment. Sounds like some Malnus was a real pleasant guy, Adrian said. Renwick offered an uncomfortable smile and turned away. "I've watched the events many times, studied them really, and I've ridden but never used a lance. Why don't you get my man and we'll have a look at you?" Renwick nodded and ran to fetch the horse Ethelwood had provided, a brown charger named Malevolent for Hadrian. Bred for stamina and agility, the horse was dressed in a chanfron to protect the animal from poorly aimed lancers. Despite the name, he was a fine horse, strong and aggressive but not vicious. Malevolent didn't bite or kick, and upon meeting Hadrian, the horse affectionately rubbed his head up and down against the fighter's chest. "Get aboard," Hadrian told the boy, who grinned and scrambled into the high-backed saddle. Adrian handed him a practice lance and the shield with green and white quadrants, which the regions had supplied. "Lean forward and keep the lance tucked tight against your side. Squeeze it in with your elbow to steady it. Now ride in a circle so I can watch you." For all his initial enthusiasm, the boy looked less confident. As he struggled to hold the long pole, and guide the horse at the same time. "The steps need to be tighter," Sir Brecton said as he rode up. Brecton sat astride a strong white charger, adorned with an elegant comparison of gold and blue stripes. A matching pennant flew from the tip of a lance, booted in his strap. Dressed in brightly polished armor, he had a plumed helm under one arm, and a sheer blue scarf tied around the other. "I wanted to wish you good fortune this day," he said to Hadron. "Thanks, you ride against Martha's. Do you not? He is good with alarms. Don't underestimate him." Brecton studied Hadrian critically. "Yorkshire ass is light, that's very brave of you." Adrian looked down at himself confused. He had never worn such heavy armor. His experience with the lance remained confined to actual combat in which targets were rarely knights. As it was, Adrian felt uncomfortable and restricted. Brecton motioned to the metal plate on his own side. Molded armor adds an extra layer of protection. Where one is most likely to be hit, and where is your elbow pocket? Adrian was confused for a moment. "Oh, that plate by the smith. Take it off." It made it impossible to hold the lance tight. Brecton chuckled. "You do realize that clay does meant to brace the butt of the lance, right?" Adrian shrugged. "I've never jousted in a tournament before." "I see." Sir Brecton nodded. "Would you be offended should I offer advice?" "No, go ahead. Keep your head up, lean forward. Use the stirrups to provide leverage. To deliver stronger blows, absorb the blows you receive with the high back of your saddle to avoid being driven from your horse again." "Thank you. Not at all. I am pleased to be of service. If you have any questions, I will be most happy to answer them." "Really?" Hadron responded mischievously. "In that case, is that a token I see on your arm?" Brecton glanced down at the bit of cloth. "This is the scarf of Lady Amelia of Terran Vale. I ride for her this day for her and her honor." He looked out at the field. "It appears the tournament is about to start. I see Martha's taking his position in the alley, and you are up first. May Maribor guide the arm of the worthy." Rector nodded respectfully and left. Brenwick returned and dismounted. "You did well," Adrian told him, taking the squire's place on the charger. "You just need a bit more practice. Assuming I survive this tilt, we'll work on it some more." The boy carried Hadrian's helm in one hand, and taking the horse's lead in the other, led the mounted knights to the field. They entered the gate, circled the alley, and came to a stop next to a small wooden stage. Ahead of Hadrian lay the main arena, which an army of workers had spent weeks preparing. By clearing snow and laying sand, the field was surrounded by a sea of spectators. Divided into sections designated by color, purple has the ruler and his immediate family. Blue was for the ranked gentry, red for the church officials, yellow for the baronage, green for the artisans, and white for the peasantry, which was the largest and only uncovered section. Adrian's father used to bring him to the games, but not for entertainment. Observing combat had been part of his studies. Still, Adrian had been thrilled to see the fights and cheer the victors along with the rest. His father had no use for the winners and cared to discuss only the losers. Danbury questioned Adrian after each fight, asking what the defeated valiant warrior had done wrong and how he could have won. Adrian had hardly listened. He was distracted by the spectacle, the knights in shining armor, the women in colorful gowns, incredible horses he knew. One knight's saddle was worth more than their home, and his father's blacksmith shop combined. A magnificent they'd all seemed. In comparison to his commoner father, it had never occurred to him the Danbury Black Border could defeat every knight in every contest. As a youth, Hadron had dreamed of fighting at High Court 1,000,000 times. Unlike the Palace of the Four Winds, this field was a church to him. Battles were respectful, not to the death. Swords were blunted, archers used targets, and jousts were performed with the lands of peace. A combatant lost points if he killed his opponent and could be expelled from the tournament, even for injuring a competitor's horse. Adrian had found that strange. even after his father had explained that the horse was innocent. He hadn't understood. He did now. A large man with a loud voice stood on a platform in front of the purple section, shouting to those assembled, "Is the chief valiant warrior of Alban and the son of the Earl of Fenton, and he is renowned for his skill in the games and at court. I give to you Sir Marthas." The crowd erupted in applause, drumming their feet on the hollow planks. Ethelud and Salder sat to either side of the throne that remained as empty as the one in the banquet great chamber. At the start of the day, officials had announced that the Empress felt to ill that morning to attend. From Renya de Hales, the man on the box shouted as he gestured toward Hadron, only recently knighted, amidst the carnage of the bloody clash of Ratibor. He wandered forest and field to reach these games for his first tournament ever. I present to you, Sir Hadrian. Some clapping trickled down from the stands, but it was only polite applause. The contest was already over in the eyes of the crowd. Adrian had never held a lance of peace, lighter than a war lance which had a metal tip. This one was all wood. The broad flared and floated awkwardly, but it was still solid oak and not to be underestimated. He checked his feet in the stirrups and gripped the horse with his legs across the sand-strewn alley. Samartha sat on his gray destria. His horse was a strong, angry-looking steed, cloaked in a damask comparison, covered in a series of black and white squares and fringed with matching tassels. Marthas himself held a Lawson shield and wore a matching circuit and cape of black and white diamonds. He snapped his visor shut just as the trumpeter sounded the fanfare and the flagman raised his banner. Mesmerized by the spectacle, Adrian let his gaze roam from the stands to the snapping pennants and finally to the percussionists, beating on their great drums, the pounding roads like thunder, such that Hadrian could feel it in his chest, yet the roar of the crowd overwhelmed it. Many leapt to their feet in anticipation. Hundreds waited anxiously, with every eye fixed upon the riders. As a boy in the white stands, Hadron had held his father's fingers, hearing and feeling that same percussive din. He had wished to be one of those knights, waiting at their gates, waiting for glory. The wish had been a fantasy that only a young boy, who knew so little of the world, could imagine. An impossible dream he had forgotten until that moment. The drums stopped. The flag fell across the alley. Martha spurred his horse and charged. Caught by surprise, Adrian was several seconds behind. He spurred malevolent and lurched forward. The audience sprang to their feet. Gasping in astonishment, some screamed in fear. Adrian ignored them, intent on his task. Feeling the rhythm of the horse's stride, he became one with the motion. Adrian pushed the balls of his feet down, taking up every ounce of slack and pressing his lower back against the saddle. Slowly, carefully, he lowered the lance, pulling it to his side and keeping its movement in sync with the horse's rapid gait. He calculated the drop rate with the approach of his target. The wind roared past Adrian's ears and stung his eyes as the charger built up speed. The horse's hooves pounded the soft track, creating explosions of sand. Murthos raced at him, his black and white cape flying. The horses ran full out, nostrils flaring, muscles rippling, harnesses jangling. Crack! Adrian felt his lance jolt, then splinter running out of lane. He discarded the broken lance and pulled back on the reins. Adrian was embarrassed by his slow start and didn't want Murthas to get the jump on him again, intent on getting the next glance first. He wheeled his charger and saw Murthas's horse trotting, riderless, to squares, and a groom chased the destria. Adrian spotted Murthas lying on his back. Along the alley, men ran to the knight's aid. As he struggled to sit up, Padrone looked for Renwick, and as he did, he noticed the crowd. They were alive with excitement. All of them were on their feet, clapping and whistling. A few even cheered his name. Adrian guessed they hadn't expected him to survive the first round. He let himself a smile, and the crowd cheered even louder. "Sir, Renwick shouted over the roar. Running to Adrian's side, "You didn't put your helm on." The squire held up the plumed helmet. "Sorry," Adrian apologized. "I forgot. I didn't expect them to start the run so quickly. Sorry. But no one tilts without a helm." Renwick said, an astonished look on his face. "He could have killed you." Adrian glanced over his shoulder at Murthas, hobbling off the field with the help of two men, and shrugged. "Lay survived. Survived. Murphys didn't even touch you and you destroyed him. That's a whole lot better than just survived. Besides, you did it without a helm. I've never seen anyone do that. And the way you hit him. You punched him off his horse like he hit a wall. You're amazing. Beginner's fortune, I guess." "I'm all done here, right?" Renwick nodded and swallowed several times. "You'll go on to the second round day after tomorrow. Good. How about we go see how well you do of the carousel? Miner and the Quentin gotta watch that Quentin. If you don't hit it clean, the billet will swing around and knock you off." "I know," Renwick replied, but his expression showed. He was still in a state of shock. His eyes kept shifting from Hadrian to Murthas, and back to the still cheering crowd. Amelia had never been to the tournament before. She'd never seen a joust. Sitting in the stands, Amelia realized she hadn't even been outside the palace in more than a year. Despite the cold, she was enjoying herself. Perched on a thick velvet cushion, she draped a lush blanket over her lap and held a warm cup of cider between her hands. Everything was so pretty. So many bright colors filled the otherwise bleak winter world. All around her, the privileged were grouped according to their stations. Across the field, the poor swarmed, trapped behind fence rails. They blended into a single, gray mass that almost faded into the background of muddy snow. Without seeds, they stood in the slush, shuffling their feet and stuffing hands into sleeves. Still, they were obviously happy to be there, happy to see the spectacle. "That's 3 broken lances for Prince Rudolph." The Duchess squealed, clapping enthusiastically. A fine example of grand imperial entertainment. Not that his performance compares to Sir Hadrian's. Everyone thought the poor man was doomed. I still can't believe he rode without a helm. And what he did to Sir Marthas, well, it will certainly be an exciting tournament this year. Amelia, very exciting indeed. Lady Genevieve tugged at Amelia's sleeve and pointed. "Oh, see there, now bringing out the blue and gold flag. Those are Subricton's colors. He's up next, yes, here he comes, and see on his arm he wears your token. How exciting!" The other ladies, they're positively drooling. "Now don't look, Nadia, they're all staring at you." If eyes were daggers and glares lethal, she trailed off as if Amelia should know the rest. "They all see your conquest, my darling, and hate you. How wonderful, is it?" Amelia asked, noticing how many of the other ladies were staring at her. She bowed her head and kept her eyes focused on her lap. "I don't want to be hated. Nonsense knights aren't the only ones who dealt. At these tournaments, everyone comes to this field as a competitor, and there can only be one victor. The only difference is that the knights spar in the daylight, the ladies compete by candlelight. Clearly you won your first round, but now we must see if your conquest was a wise one, as your victory remains locked with his prowess. Breton is riding against Gilbert. This should be a close challenge. Gilbert actually killed a man a few years ago. It was an accident, of course, but it still gives him an edge over his opponents, although rumor has it that he hurt his leg to Knight's back, so we shall see." Killed. Amelia felt her stomach tighten as the trumpet blared, and the flag flew. Hooves shook the ground, and her heart raced as panic flooded her. She shut her eyes before the impact. Crack, the crowd roared. Opening her eyes, she saw Gilbert, still mounted but reeling. Subrictum trotted back to his gate unharmed. That's one last for Bracton. Leo mentioned to no one in particular. The Duke sat on the far side of Genevieve, appearing more animated than Amelia had ever seen him. The Duchess ran on for hours, talking about everything and anything. But Leopold almost never spoke. When he did, it was so softly that Amelia thought his words were directed to Maribor. Alone, Nimbus sat to Amelia's right, frequently glancing at her. He looked tense, and she loved him for it. That Gilbert, look at the way they are propping him up, the Duchess prattled on. He really shouldn't ride again. Oh, but he's taking the lance. How brave of him. He needs to get the tip up. Leopold noted. Oh yes, Leo, you are right. As always, he doesn't have the strength. And look at Brecton waiting patiently. Do you see the way the sun shines off his armor? He doesn't normally clean it. He's a warrior, not a tournament knight. But he went to the metalsmith and ordered it polished, so that the wind itself could see its face within the gleam. Now why do you suppose a man who hasn't combed his hair in months does such a thing? Amelia felt terrified, embarrassed, and happy beyond what she had believed to be the bounds of emotion. The trumpet blared, and again the horses charged. A lance cracked, Gilbert fell, and once again Brecton emerged untouched. The crowd cheered, and to Amelia's surprise, she found herself on her feet along with the rest. She had a smile on her face that she couldn't wipe away. Brexton made certain Gilbert was all right, then trotted over to the stands and stopped in front of Amelia's seat in the noble's box. He tossed aside his broken lance, pulled off his helm, rose in his stirrups, and bowed to her. Without thinking, she walked down the steps toward the railing. As she stepped out from under the canopy into the sun, the cheers grew louder, especially from the commoner side of the field. For you, my lady, Sir Bracton told her. He made a sound to his horse, which also bowed, and once more the crowd roared. Her heart was light, her mind empty, and her whole life invisible, except for that one moment in the sun, feeling Nimbus's hand on her arm. She turned and saw Sodder scowling from the stands. It's not wise to linger in the sun too long. My lady, Numbers warned, you might get burned. The expression on Saldo's face dragged Amelia back to reality. She returned to her seat, noticing the venomous glares from the nobles around her. My dear, the Duchess said in an uncharacteristic whisper, for someone who doesn't know how to play the game, you are as remarkable as Sir Hadrian today. Amelia sat quietly through the few remaining tilts, which she hardly noticed. When the day's competition had ended, they exited the stands. Members led the way, and the Duchess walked beside her, holding on to Amelia's arm. You will be coming with us to the hunt on the Eve's Eve, won't you, Amelia? Dear Lady Genevieve asked, as they walked across the field. To the waiting carriages you simply must. I have Lois work all week on a dazzling white gown and matching winter cape, so you'll have something new. Where can we find snow white fur for the hood? She paused a moment, then waved the thought away. Oh well, I let her work that out. See you then, Tata. She blew Amelia a kiss as the ducal carriage left. The boy was just standing there. He waited on the far side of the street, revealed when the Duke and Duchess's coach pulled away. A filthy little thing, he stared at Amelia, looking both terrified and determined. In his arms he held a soiled bag. He caught her eye and with a stone resolve slipped through the fence. Me, my lady, and me, was all he got out, before a soldier grabbed him roughly and shoved him flat. The boy cowered in the snow, looking desperate. Lady, please. The guard kicked him hard in the stomach, and the boy crumpled around his foot, his eyes squeezed shut in pain, as another soldier kicked him in the back. Stop it, Amelia shouted. Leave him alone. The guards paused, confused. On the ground the boys struggled to breathe. Help them up. She took a step toward the child, but members caught her by the arm. Perhaps not here, my lady, his eyes indicated the crowd around the line of carriages, many restraining to see what the commotion was about. You've already annoyed Regent Sodder once today. She paused, then glanced at the boy. Put him in my carriage, she instructed the guards. They lifted the lad and shoved him forward. He dropped his bundle and pulled free, in time to grab it before scurrying into the coach. Amelia glanced at Nimbus, who shrugged. The two followed the youth inside, a look of horror on his face. The boy cowered, on the seat across from Amelia and Nimbus. The courtier eyed the lad critically. I'd have to say he's 10, no more than 12, an orphan certainly, and nearly feral by the look of him. What do you suppose he has in the bag? A dead rat. Oh, stop, at Nimbus. Amelia rebuked. Of course it's not. It's probably just his lunch. Exactly, the tutor agreed. Amelia glared. Hush, you're frightening him. Me. He's the one who came at us with the moldy bag of mystery. Are you all right? Amelia asked the boy softly. He managed to nod, but just barely. His eyes kept darting around the interior of the carriage, but always came back to Amelia, as if you were mesmerized. I'm sorry about the guards. That was awful the way they treated you. Nimbus, do you have some coppers? Anything we could give them? The courtier looked helpless. I'm sorry, my lady. I'm not in. The habit of bearing coin disappointed Amelia's side, and then tried to put on a happy face. What was it you wanted to say to me? She asked. The boy wetted his lips. I have something to give the Empress. He looked down at the bag. What is it? Amelia tried not to cringe at the possibilities. I heard. Well, they said she couldn't be at the tournament today because she was sick and all. That's when I knew I had to get this to her. He patted the bag. Guess what, to her? What's in the bag? Something that can heal her. Oh dear, it is a dead rat, isn't it? Nimbus shivered in disgust. The boy pulled the bag open and drew out a folded, shimmering robe, unlike anything Amelia had ever seen before. It saved the life of my best friend. Healed him overnight, it did. It's magical, it is. A religious relic, members ventured. Amelia smiled at the boy. What's your name? They call me Mince, my lady. I can't say what my real name is. But Mince works well enough. It does. Well, Mince. This is a generous gift. This looks very expensive. Don't you think you should keep it? It's certainly better than what you're wearing. Mince shook his head. I think it wants me to give it to the Empress. To help her, if once she asked. It's kind of hard to explain. Such things usually are, the courtier said. So can you give this to her? Perhaps you should let him give it to a Nimbus, suggested to Amelia. Are you serious? She replied. You wanted to return for the misdeeds of the guards, didn't you? For the likes of him meeting the Empress will more than make up for a few bruises. Besides, he's just a boy, no one will care. Amelia thought a moment, staring at the wide-eyed child. What do you think, Mince? Would you like to give it to the Empress yourself? The boy looked as if he might faint. Medina had found a mouse in her chamber 3 months earlier. When she had lit the lamp, it had frozen in panic in the middle of the room. Picking it up, she felt its little chest heave as it panted for breath. Clearly terrified, it looked back at her with its dark, tiny eyes. Medina thought it might die of fright. Even after she set it down, it still didn't move. Only after the light had been out for several minutes did she hear it scurry away. The mouse had never returned until now. He was not that mouse, but the boy looked just the same. He lacked the fur tail and whiskers, but the eyes were unmistakable. He stood fearfully still, the only movement the result of his heaving chest and trembling body. Did you say his name was Mouse? Mince, I think he said. Familiar corrected. It is Mince, isn't it? The boy said nothing, clutching the bag to his chest. I found him at the tournament. He wants to give you a gift. Go on, Mince. Instead of speaking, Mince abruptly thrust the bag out with both hands. He wanted to give this to you because, soldier, announce that you were too sick to attend the tournament. He says it has healing powers. Medina took the bag, opened it, and drew forth the robe. Despite having been stuffed in the old dirty sack, the garment shimmered, not a single wrinkle or stain on it. It's beautiful, she said sincerely as she held it up, watching it play with the light. It reminds me of someone I once knew. I will cherish it. When the boy heard the words, tears formed in his eyes and streaked his dirty cheeks. Falling to his knees, he placed his face on the floor before her. Puzzled, Medina glanced at Amelia, but the imperial secretary only offered a shrug. The emperor stared at the boy for a moment, and then said to Amelia, "He looks starved. Do you want me to take him to the kitchen?" "No, leave him here. Go have some food sent up." After Amelia left the room, Medina laid the robe on a chair, and then sat on the edge of the bed, watching the boy. He hadn't moved and remained kneeling, with his head still touching the floor. After a few minutes he looked up but said nothing. Medina spoke gently. "I'm very good at playing the silent game too. We can sit here for days not saying a word if you want." The boy's lips trembled. He opened his mouth as if to speak, and then stopped. "Go ahead, it's okay." Once he started, the words came out in a flood, as if he felt the need to say everything with a single breath. "I just want you to get better, that's all, honest. I brought you the road because it saved kind C. It healed him overnight, I tell you. He was dying, and he would have been dead by morning for sure. But the road made him better. Then today, when they said you was too sick to see the tournament, I knew I had to bring you the road to make you better. You see, I'm sorry, Mince, but I'm afraid a robe can't heal what's wrong with me." The boy friend, but it healed kind, and his lips were blue. Medina walked over and sat down on the floor in front of him. "I know you mean well, and it's a wonderful gift, but some things can never be fixed. But no buts, you need to stop worrying about me. Do you understand? Boy, you just have to. Will you do that for me?" The boy looked up and locked eyes with her. "I would do anything for you." The sincerity and conviction in his voice staggered her. "I love you," he added. Those 3 words shook her. And even though she was sitting on the floor, the Empress put a hand down to steady herself. "No," she said. "You can't. You just met." "Yes, I do." Medina shook her head. "No, you don't." She snapped. "No one does." The boy flinched as if struck. He looked back down at the floor and nevertheless added in a whisper, "But I do. Everyone does." The Empress stared at him. "What do you mean, everyone?" "Everyone," the boy said, puzzled. He gestured toward the window. "You mean the people in the city? Well, sure, them. But not just here, everywhere. Everyone loves you." The boy repeated, "Folks been coming to the city from all over. I hear them talking, they all come to see you, all of them, saying how the world's gonna be better, 'cause you're here, how they would die for you." Stunned, Medina stood up. Slowly, she turned and walked to the window, where she gazed into the distance above the roofs, to the hills and snow-covered mountains beyond. "Did I say something wrong?" Mince asked. She turned back. "No, not at all. It's just that." Medina paused. She moved to the mirror and ran her fingertips along the glass. "There are still 10 days to Wintertide, right?" "Yes." "Why?" "Well, because you gave me a gift. I'd like to give you something in return. And it looks like I still have time." She crossed to the door and opened it. Gerald stood waiting outside as always. "Gerald," she said, "could you please do me a favor?" Chapter 15, The Hunt. "Merry Eves, Sir Adrian," a girl said brightly, when he poked his head outside his room. She was just one of the giggling chambermaids who'd been extending smiles and curtsies to him since the day of the first joust. After his second tilt, pages bowed and guards nodded in his direction. His third win, although as clean as the others, had been the worst, as it brought the attention of every valiant warrior and noble in the palace. After each joust, he had his choice of sitting in his dormitory or going to the great chamber. Preferring to be alone, Adrian usually chose his room that morning. Like most days, Adrian found himself wandering the palace hallways. He'd seen Albert from a distance on a few occasions, but neither attempted to speak with the other, and there had been no sign of Royce crossing through the grand foyer. He paused. The staircase spiraled upward, adorned in fanciful candles and painted wood ornaments. Somewhere for flights up, the girl he had known as Thrace was probably still asleep in her bed. He put his foot on the first step. To Adrian, a man he did not recognize asked, Great, just yesterday, you really gave Layden a hit he'll not soon forget. I heard the crack even in the high stands. They say loud and we'll need a new breastplate. And you gave him to broken ribs to boot. What a hit, what a hit. I say, you know. I lost a bundle betting against you, the first 3 jousts. But since then I've won everything back. I'm sticking with you for the final. You've made a believer out of me. Say where you headed. Adrian quickly drew back his foot. Nowhere, just stretching my legs a bit. Well, just wanted to tell you to keep up the good work. And let you know I'll be rooting for you. The man exited the palace through the grand arrival, leaving Hadrian at the bottom of the stairs. What am I going to do, walk into a chambers unannounced? It's been over a year since I spoke with her. Will she hate me for not trying to see her earlier? Will she remember me at all? He locked up the staircase once more. It's possible she's all right. Isn't it just because no one ever sees her? Doesn't necessarily mean anything, does it? Medina was the empress. They couldn't be treating her too badly. When she lived in Dahlgren, she had been happy. And that had been a squalid little village, where people were killed nightly by a giant monster. How much worse can living? In a palace bee, he took one last look around and spotted the 2 shadows, leaning casually near the archway to the throne room. With a sigh, Adrian turns toward the service wing, leaving the stairway behind. The sun was not fully up, but the kitchen was already bustling. Huge pots billowed, clouds of steam so thick that the walls cried tears. Butchers hammered on cutting blocks, shouting orders. Boys ran with buckets, shouting back. Girls scrubbed, cutlery, pans, and bowls. The smells were strong and varied. Some, such as that of baked bread, were wonderful, but others were sulphurous and vile. Unlike in the rest of the palace, no holiday decoration adorned the walls or tables here. Behind the scenes, the signs of wintertide were reduced to cooling. Trays of candied apples and snowflake-shaped cookies. Adrian stepped into the scullery, fascinated by the activity. As soon as he entered, heads turned, work slowed, and then everything came to a stop. The room grew so quiet that the only sounds came from the bubbling pots, the crackling fires, and water dripping from a wet ladle. All the staff stared at him, as if he had 2 heads or 3 arms. Hadrian took a seat on one of the stools. Surrounding an open table, the modest area appeared to be the place where the kitchen staff ate their own meals. He tried to look casual and relaxed, but it was impossible with all the attention. What's all this now, boom? The voice belonging to a large, beefy cook, with a thick beard and eyes wreathed and cheerful wrinkles. Spotting Hadrian, those eyes narrowed abruptly. He revealed, if only for a moment, that he had another side. The same way a playful dog might suddenly growl at an intruder. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, approaching Adrian with a meat cleaver in one hand. "I don't mean any harm. I was just hoping to find some food." The cook looked him over closely. "Are you a valiant warrior, sir?" Adrian nodded. "About earlier, I see. I'll have whatever you want brought to the great chamber. Actually, I'd rather eat here. Is that okay?" "I'm sorry," the cook said, confused. "If you don't mind me asking, why would a fine, no woman like yourself won't you eat in a hot, dirty kitchen surrounded by the clan of pots and the gibbering of maids?" "I just feel more comfortable here," Adrian said. "I think a man ought to be at ease when eating. Of course, if it's a problem." He stood. "You're so Adrian, aren't you? I haven't found the time to see the jousts, but as you can see, most of my staff has. You're quite a celebrity. I've heard all kinds of stories about you, and your recent changing fortune, or any of them true. Well, I can't say about the stories, but my name is Adrian. Nice to meet you." "Name's Ibis Thinley. Have a seat, sir. I'll fix you right up." He hurried away, scolding his crew to return to work. Many continued to glance over at Adrian, stealing looks. When they felt the head cook couldn't see, in a short while Ibis returned with a plate of chicken, fried eggs and biscuits, and a mug of dark beer. The chicken was so hot that it hurt Adrian's fingers. and the biscuits steamed when he pulled them open. I appreciate this, Adrian," told Ibis, taking a bite of biscuit. Ibis gave him a surprised look and then chuckled. By ma thanking a cook for food. Them stories are true, aren't they? Adrian shrugged. I guess I have a hard time remembering that I'm noble. When I was a commoner, I always knew what noble meant. But now not so much. The cock smiled. Lady Amelia has the same problem. I gotta say, it's nice to see decent folk getting ahead. In this world, the news is, you've ruled. The field at High Court beat every night. You rode against you. I even heard you open the tournament by tilting against some earthers without a helm. Adrian nodded with a mouthful of chicken, which he shifted from side to side, trying to avoid a burnt tongue. When a man does that, Ibis went on, and comes from the salt like the rest of us, he wins favor among the lower classes. Yes, indeed. Those of us with dirty expressions and sweaty backs get quite a thrill from one, such as you, sir. Adrian didn't know how to respond, and contented himself with swallowing his chicken. He had ridden to the sound of roaring crowds every time he had competed, but Adrian wasn't there for applause. His task was dark secret and is not worthy of praise. It unsettled 5 knights, and by the rules of the contest, owned their amounts. Agent had declined that privilege. He had no need for the horses, but it was more than just that. He didn't deserve them. All he wanted was the lives of Arista and Gond. In his mind, the whole affair was tainted. Taking anything else from his victories, even the pleasure of success, would be wrong. Nevertheless, the crowds cheered each time. He refused his right to amend, believing him humble and chivalrous, instead of what he was, a murderer in waiting. It's just you and Bretchen now, isn't it? Ibis asked. Adrian nodded. Gloomily, we tilt tomorrow. There's some sort of hunt today. Oh yes, the hawking. I'll be roasting. Plenty of game birds for tonight's grand banquet. Say, are you going? Just here for the joust, Adrian managed to say. Even though his mouth was full again, Ibis bent his head to get a better look for new night. On the verge of winning the winter tide. High Court tournament, you don't seem very happy. It's not the food, I hope. Adrian shook his head. Food's great. Kind of hoping you'll let me eat my midday meal here, too. You're welcome anytime, huh? Listen to me sounding like an innkeeper of Castle Lord. I'm just a cook. He hooked a thumb over his shoulder. Sure, these mongrels quiver up my voice. But you're a valiant warrior. You can go wherever you please. Still, if my food has placed you in a charitable mood, I would ask one favor. What's that? Lady Amelia holds a special place in my heart. She's like a daughter to me, a sweet, sweet lass. And it seems she's recently taken a liking to Sub. Brecton. He's good, mind you. A fine lancer, but from what I've heard, you're likely to beat him. Now, I'm not saying anything against you. Someone of my station would be a fool to even insinuate such a thing, but, well, some knights try to inflict as much damage as they can, taking aim and advisor and such, if something were to happen to Brexton. Well, I just don't want Amelia to get hurt. She's never had much, you see, comes from a poor family, and has worked hard all her life. Even now that boss, Regent Soldier, keeps her slaving day and night, but even so she's been happy lately. And I'd like to see that continue. Agent kept his eyes on his plate, concentrating on mopping up yolk with a crust of bread. So anyway, if at all possible, it'll be real nice if you went a bit easy on Brexton, so he doesn't get hurt. I know, of course, that you can't always help it. Dear Maribor, I know that, but I can tell by talking with you that you're a decent fellow. I don't even know why I brought it up. You do the right thing, I can tell. Here, let me get you some more beer. Ibis thinly walked away, taking Hadrian's mug and appetite with him. In many ways, Amelia felt like a child Sauter had brought into the world that day in the kitchen when it elevated her to the rank of lady. Now she was little more than a toddler, still trying to master simple tasks and often making mistakes. No one said anything, no one pointed and laughed, but there were knowing looks and partially hidden smiles. She felt out of her element when trying to navigate the numerous traps and hazards of courtly life without a map. When addressed as my lady by a finely dressed noble, Amelia felt uncomfortable. Seeing a guard snap to attention at her passing was strange, especially since those same soldiers had grinned loudly at her little more than a year earlier. Amelia was certain the guards still leered and the nobles still laughed, but now they did so behind polite eyes. She believed the only means of banishing the silent snickers was to fit in. If Amelia didn't stumble as she walked, spill a glass of wine, speak too loudly, wear the wrong color, laugh when she should remain quiet, or remain quiet when she should laugh, then they might forget she used to scrub their dishes. Anytime Amelia interacted with the nobility was an ordeal, but when she did so in an unfamiliar setting, she became ill. For this reason, Amelia avoided eating anything the morning of the hawking. The whole court embarked on the day-long event. Knights, nobles, ladies, and servants all rode out together to the forest and field for the great hunt. Dogs trotted in their wake. Amelia had never sat on a horse before. She had never ridden a pony, a mule, or even an ox, but that day she found herself precariously balanced atop a massive white charger. She wore the beautiful white gown and matching cape Lady Genevieve had provided her, which by no accident perfectly matched her horse's coat. Her right leg was hooked between two horns of the saddle, and her left foot rested on a planchette. Sitting this way made staying on the animals back in demanding enterprise. Each jerk and shift set a heart pounding, and her hands grasping for the charger's braided mane. On several occasions she nearly toppled backward. Amelia imagined that if she were to fall, she would wind up hanging by her trapped leg, skirt over her head, while the horse pranced proudly about. The thought terrified her so much that she barely breathed and sat rigid with her eyes fixed on the ground below. For the 2-hour ride into the wilderness, Amelia didn't speak a word. She dared to look up only when the huntsman called for the party's attention. They emerged from the shade of a forest into the light of a field. Tall brown rushes jutted from beneath the snow's cover. The flicker of morning sunlight was reflected by moving water or a river cut the landscape. Lacking any wind, the world was oddly quiet. The huntsman directed them to line up by spreading out along the edge of the forest and facing the marsh. Amelia was pleased to arrive at what she hoped was their destination, and proud of how she had managed to direct her horse without delay or mishap. Finally, at a standstill, she allowed herself a breath of relief, only to see the falconer approaching. "What bird will you be using today, my lady?" he asked, looking up at her from within his red coif. His hands were encased in thick gloves. She swallowed. What would you suggest?" The falconer appeared surprised, and Amelia felt as if she had done something wrong. "Well, my lady, there are many scavenger creatures, but no set regulation. Tradition usually reserves the jerk falcon for a king, a falcon for a prince or duke, a peregrine for an earl, a bastard hawk for a baron, a saker for a valiant warrior, a gosh hawk for a noble, Kersel for a poor man, sparrow hawk for a priest, Castro for a servant, and a Maryland for a lady. But in practice, it is more a matter of she will be using my dress," the Duchess of Rochelle announced, trotting up beside them. "Of course, your ladyship." The falconer bowed his head and made a quick motion with his hand. A servant raced up with a huge hooded bird held on his fist. "Your gauntlet, my lady," the falconer said, holding out a rough elk hide glove. "You'll want to put that on your left hand, darling," the ducker said with a reassuring smile and mischievous glint in her eyes. Amelia felt her heart flutter as she took the glove and pulled it on. "Hold your hand up, dear. Out away from your face," Lady Genevieve instructed. The falconer took the raptor from the servant and carried her over. The hawk was magnificent and blinded by a leather hood with a short, decorative plume while being transferred to Amelia. Murderess spread her massive wings and flapped twice. As a powerful talons took hold of the glove, the hawk was lighter than she had expected. And Amelia had no predicament holding her up. Still, Amelia's fear of falling was replaced by her fear of the bird. She watched in terror as the falconer wrapped the jess around her wrist, tethering her to the hawk. Beautiful bird. Amelia heard a voice say, "Yes, it is," she replied, looking over to see Sir Brecton taking station on her left. Amelia thought she might faint. "It's the Duchess of Rochelle's," she. Amelia turned. The Duchess had moved off, abandoning her. Panic made her stomach lurch. As friendly as Lady Genevieve was, Amelia was starting to suspect the woman enjoyed tormenting her. Amelia tried to calm herself as she sat face to face with the one man in the entire world she wanted to impress, with one hand holding the bird and the other locked onto the horse's reins. She realized the cold was causing her nose to run. She couldn't imagine the day getting any worse. Then, as if the gods had heard her thoughts, they answered using the huntsman's voice. "Everyone ride forward, oh dear Maribor." Her horse tripped on the rough frost-heaved ground, throwing her off balance. The sudden jolt also startled Murderers, who threw out her great wings to save herself by flying, tethered to Amelia's wrist. The hawk pulled on her arm. She might have stayed in the Cybele, if not for the scavenger creature's insistence on dragging her backward. Amelia cried out as she fell over the rump of the horse, her nightmare becoming reality. Yet before she cleared the saddle, she stopped. So Brecton had caught her around the waist, though he wore no armor. His arm felt like a band of steel, solid and unmovable. Gently he drew her upright. The bird flapped twice more, then settled down and gripped Amelia's glove again. Brecton didn't say a word. He held Amelia steady until she reseated herself on the saddle and placed her foot on the planchette. Horrified and flushed with humiliation, she refused to look at him. Why did that have to happen in front of him? She didn't want to see his face and find the same condescending smirk she had seen on so many others. On the verge of tears, she wanted desperately to be back at the palace, back in the kitchen, back to cleaning pots. At that moment, she preferred the thought of facing Edith, Mon, or even her vengeful ghost, to that of enduring the humiliation of facing Subrecton, feeling tears gathering. She clenched her jaw and breathed deeply in an effort to hold them back. Does it have a name? So Bretton's words were so unexpected that Amelia replayed them twice before understanding the question. Murderess, she replied, thanking Maribor that her voice didn't crack. That seems appropriate. There was a pause before he continued. Beautiful day, isn't it? Yes, she tasked her brain to think of something to add, but it came back with nothing. Why is he talking like that? Why is he asking about the weather? The knight sighed heavily. Looking up at him, she found he wasn't smirking, but appeared pained. His eyes accidentally met hers while she studied his face, and he instantly looked away. His fingers drummed a marching cadence on his saddle horn. Cold though, he said, and quickly added, could be warmer, don't you think? Yes, she said again, realizing she must sound like an idiot. With all her one-word answers, she wanted to say more. She wanted to be witty and clever, but her brain was as frozen as the ground. Amelia caught him glancing at her again. This time he shook his head and sighed once more. What? She asked fearfully. I don't know how you do it, he said. The genuine admiration in his eyes only baffled her further. You ride a war horse side saddle over rough ground with a huge hawk perched on your arm, and are still managing to make me feel like a squire in a fencing match. My lady, you are a marvel beyond reckoning. I am in awe. Amelia stared at him until she realized she was staring at him. In her mind, she ordered her eyes to look away, but they refused. She had no words to reply, which hardly mattered, as Amelia had no air in her body with which to speak. Breathing seemed unimportant at that moment. Forcing herself to take a breath, Amelia discovered she was grinning. A second later, she knew Sir Brecton noticed as well, and he abruptly stopped drumming and sat. "Straighter," Milady said the falconer servant. "It's time to release your bird." Amelia looked at the raptor, wondering just how she was going to do that. "May I help?" Sir Brecton asked, reaching over. He removed Murderous's hood and unwound her tether. With a motion of his own arm, the servant indicated that she should thrust her hand up. Amelia did so, and Murderous spread her great wings, pushed down and took to the sky. The raptor climbed higher and higher, yet remained circling directly overhead. As she watched the goshawk, Amelia noticed Brecton looking at her. "Don't you have a bird?" she asked. "No, I did not expect to be hawking. Truth be told, I haven't hunted in years. I'd forgotten the joy of it until now, so you know how." "Oh yes, of course. I used to hunt the fields of Chadwick as a lad. My father, my brother Wesley, and I would spend whole weeks chasing fowl from their nests and rodents from their burrows. Would you think ill of me if I told you? This was my first time." Brecton's face turned serious, which frightened her until he said, "My lady, be assured that, should I live so long as to see the day that the sun does not rise, the rivers do not flow, and the winds do not blow, I would never think ill of you." She tried to hide another smile. Once more she failed. And once more so Brecton noticed, "Perhaps you can help me, as I am befuddled by all of this." Amelia said, gesturing at her surroundings, "It's a simple thing. The scavenger creatures are waiting on, that is to say, hovering overhead and waiting for the attack, much the way soldiers stand in line, preparing for clash. The enemies are a crafty bunch. They lay hiding before us in the field, between the river and ourselves, with the line made by the horses. The huntsman has ensured that the prey will not come this way, which of course they would try to do to reach the safety of the trees. Were we not here, but how will we find these hidden enemies? They need to be drawn out, or in this case, flushed out. See, their huntsman has gathered the dogs." Amelia looked ahead as a crowd of eager dogs moved forward, led by a dozen boys from the palace after they were turned loose. The hounds disappeared into the undergrowth, only the raised tails appeared here and there, above the bent rushes. As they dashed into the snowy field, without a bark or a yelp, with a blue flag the huntsman signaled to the falconer, who in shift waved to the riders, indicated they should move slowly toward the river. With her bird gone, Amelia found it easier to control her horse, and advanced along with the rest. Everyone was silent as they crept forward. Amelia felt excited, although she had no idea what was about to happen. The falconer raised a hand, and the riders stopped their horses, looking up. Amelia saw the scavenger creatures had matched their movement. Across the field, the falconer waved a red flag, and the huntsman blew a whistle, which sent the dogs bursting forth. Immediately the field exploded with scavenger creatures. Loud thumping sounds erupted as quail broke from cover, racing skyward in their efforts to evade the monstrous dogs. They never saw the death awaiting them in the sky. Hawks swooped down out of the sun, slamming into their targets and bearing them to the ground. One berets prey all the way to the river, where both hawk and quail hit the water. "That was murderous," Amelia shouted, horrified, her mind filled with the realization that she had killed Lady Genevieve's prized bird. Without thinking, she kicked her horse, which leapt forward. She galloped across the field, and as she neared the river, spotted the dogs swimming out into the icy water. Another quickly followed in its wake. Two scavenger creatures flapped desperately on the surface, kicking up a white spray, just before Amelia charged headlong into the river. Brecton caught her horse by the bit and pulled them both to a hold. Wait, but the bird was all Amelia could say, her eyes locked on the splashing. "It's all right," you assured her. "Watch." The first dog reached my dress and without hesitation took the hawk in its jaws, holding the raptor up. The hounds circled and swam back at the same time. The second dog raced out to collect the downed prey. The quails struggled, but Amelia was amazed that the hawk did not fight. When the dog set its teeth, you see, Brecton said, dogs and scavenger creatures are trained to trust and protect one another. Just like soldiers, the hound climbed out of the water, still holding the hawk. Both Amelia and Brexton dismounted. As the dog brought the bird to them, gently the animal opened its jaws, and murderers hopped onto Amelia's fist. Once more, she stretched out her wings and snapped them. Spraying water. "She's all right," Amelia said, amazed. A boy ran up to her, holding out a dead bird by a string, tied around its feet. "Your quail, my lady." When Adrian returned later that day, Ibis Thinley was waiting, with more than just a plate. The entire table was laden with a variety of meats, cheeses and breads. The scullery had been cleaned, such that extra sacks were removed, shelves dusted and the floor mopped. The table was set with fresh candles, and a larger cushioned chair replaced the little stool. He guessed not all of this was strictly Ibis's doing. Apparently word of his visit had spread. Twice as many servants populated the kitchen as had that morning, most standing idle. Idas didn't speak to Hadrian this time. The cook was feverishly busy dealing with the flood of game brought in by nobles returning from the hunt. Already maids were plucking away at quail, pheasant, and duck from a long line of beheaded scavenger creatures that was strung around the room like a garland, with so much to process. Even Ibis himself skinned rabbits and squirrels. Despite his obvious urgency, the cook immediately stopped working. When Amelia arrived, "Ibis, look, I got to," she shouted. Holding the scavenger creatures above her head, she entered the kitchen, dressed in a lovely white gown and matching fur cape. "Bring them here, lass. Let me see these treasures." Adrian had seen Lady Amelia from a distance at each of the feasts, but this was the first time he had seen her up close. Since he had posed as a courier, she was prettier than he remembered. Her clothes were certainly better. Whether it was the spring in her step, by the flush in her cheeks, brought on by the cold, she appeared more alive. "These are clearly the pick of the lot," Ibis said after inspecting her trophies. "They're scrawny and small, but they're mine." She followed the declaration with a carefree, happy laugh. "Can I infer from your mood that you did not hunt alone?" Amelia said nothing and merely smiled, clasping her hands behind her back. She's such shade about the kitchen. Swinging her skirt, "Come now, girl, don't toy with me." She laughed again, spun around and announced, "He was at my side almost the whole day. A perfect gentleman by my side." And I think she hesitated. "Think what? That would at last. I think he may fancy me, bar." "Of course he fancies you, but what did the man say? Did he speak plainly? Did he spout worse? Did he kiss you right there on the field?" "Kiss me is far too proper for such vulgarity." But he was very nervous, silly even, and he couldn't seem to take his eyes off me. "Silly, Sir Bracton, unless you've got him hooked. You have a fine catch, I must say, a fine catch indeed." Amelia couldn't contain herself and laughed again, this time throwing back her head, inhalation, and twirling her gown. Doing so, she caught sight of Hadron and halted. "Sorry, I'm just having a late lunch," he said. "I'll be gone in a minute." "Oh no. You don't have to leave, it's just that I didn't see you, other than the staff. I'm the only one who ever comes down here, or so I thought. It's more comfortable than the great chamber." Adrian said, "I spend my days tilting with the knights. I don't feel like competing with them at meals too." She walked over looking puzzled. "You don't speak like a valiant warrior." "That's Sir Hadrian," Ibis informed Amelia. "Oh," she exclaimed. "You helped Sir Bracton and my poor Nimbus when they were attacked. That was very kind. You're also the one who rode in the tournament. Without a helm, you've unseasoned every opponent on the first pass, and haven't had a single lance broken on your shield. You're very good, aren't you?" "And he's riding against Sir Bracton tomorrow for the championship," Ibis reminded her. "That's right." She gasped, raising a hand to our lips. "Have you ever been unpositioned?" Hadrian shrugged self-consciously. Not since I've been a valiant warrior. Oh, I wasn't. I didn't mean to. I just wondered if it hurts terribly. I guess it can't feel good. Even with all that armor and padding, being driven from a galloping horse by a pole must not be pleasant. Her eyes grew troubled. But all the other knights are fine, aren't they? I saw Summerfees and Sirelgar on the hawking just today. They were trotting and laughing, so I'm certain everything will be all right. No matter who wins, I know tomorrow is the final tilt, and winning the tournament is a great honor. I understand firsthand the desire to prove yourself to those who look down on you. But I ask you to consider that Saberton is a good man. A very good man. He would never hurt you if he could help it. I hope you feel the same. She struggled to smile at Adrian. He put down the bread he was eating as a sickening sensation churned his stomach. Adrian had to stop eating in the kitchen. The acrobats rapidly assembled the human pyramid. Bolting one at a time into the air, they somersaulted before each landed feet first. On the shoulders of the one below, one after another they flew, continuing to build the formation until the final man reached up and touched the ceiling of the great chamber. Despite the danger involved and the exciting performance, Amelia was not watching. She had seen the act before, at the audition and rehearsals. Her eyes were on the audience as winter tied near. The entertainment at each grand banquet became grander and more extravagant. Amelia held her breath until the great chamber erupted in applause. They liked it, looking for Vicant Winslow. She spotted him clapping his hands above his head. The two exchanged wide grins. I thought I would die from stress toward the end, Nimbus whispered from the seat next to Amelia. The bruises on the tutor's face were mostly gone, and the annoying, whistling sound had finally left his nose. Yes, that was indeed excellent, said King Rosward of Dunmore. At each grand banquet, Nimbus always sat to Amelia's left, and the Queen and King sat to her right. King Rosworth was huge. He made the Duke and Duchess of Rochelle appear petite. His squat, portly build was mimicked in miniature in his face, which sagged under its own weight. Amelia imagined that even if he were thin, King Roswart would still sag like an old riding horse. His wife Frida, while no lead herself, was thin by comparison. She was dry and brittle both in looks and manner. The couple were fortunately quiet most of the time, at least until their third glasses of wine. Amelia lost count that evening, but assumed no three had arrived and perhaps already gone. All the acrobats friends of yours? The king asked, leaning around his wife to speak to Amelia. Mine, no. I merely hired them, she said. Friends of friends. Then she shook her head. But you know them, the king pressed further. I met them for the first time at the auditions, Rossi Feeder said. She's clearly trying to distance herself from them. Now that the doors of nobility are open to her, you can't blame her. For that, anyone would abandon the wretches. Leave them in the street, that's where they belong. But Amelia began before the king cut her off. Marks. My queen, many are rising in rank. Some street merchants are as wealthy as nobles now. Terrible state of affairs, Cretus snarled through thin, red-painted lips. The title isn't what it used to be. I agree, my queen. Why, some lights have no lineage at all to speak of. They're no better than peasants. With swords, all anyone needs these days is money to buy armor. And a horse. There you have it. Resto and noble commoners are even learning to read. Can you read, Lady Amelia? Actually, I can see. The king threw his hands up. Of course you're in the nobility now, but I assume you learned letters before that. It's a travesty. I don't know what the world is coming to. At least the situation with the elves has improved, his wife Pudding. You have to give Ethelred credit for reducing their numbers. Our efforts to deal with them and Dunmore have met with little success. Deal with them? Amelia asked. But the monarchs continued under their own momentum. If they had any intelligence, they would leave on their own. How much plainer can it be that they are not welcome? The king said. The guilds prohibit them from membership in Any business they can't obtain citizenship in any city. And the church declared them unclean, enemies of Navran ages ago. Even the peasants are free to take measures against them. Still, they don't take the hint. They keep breeding and filling up slums. Hundreds die each year in church-sanctioned cleansing days, but they persist. Why not move on? Why not go elsewhere? As the king ran out of breath, the queen took over. They are like rats festering in every crack. Living among that kind as a curse, it's what brought down the First Empire. You know, even keeping them as slaves was a mistake. And mark my words, if we don't get rid of them all, so that not a single elf walks a civilized street, Dog Country Lane, this empire will fall to the same ruin. Troll, the old emperors were too soft. They thought that they could fix them. Frida erupted. What a ridiculous notion. You can't fix a plague. You can only run from it to wipe it out. By now, darling, I agree with you wholeheartedly. We have a second chance now. And Ethred is off to a good start. Realizing that, the king and queen ran through a conversation as familiar and comfortable to them as a pair of well-worn shoes. Amelia nodded politely without really listening. She had seen elves only once in her life. When she had still been living in Terranvale, 3 of them had come to the village. A family, if they had such notions of kinship, apparently content to dress in rags. They were dirty and carried small stained bundles, which Amelia guessed were all they had. They were so thin they looked sick, and walked with their heads bowed and shoulders slumped. Children had called the elves names, and villagers had thrown stones and shouted for them to leave. A rock struck the female's head and she cried out. Amelia didn't throw any rocks, but she watched as the family was bruised and bloodied before they fled from town. At the time, she didn't understand how they could be a threat. The monk who had been teaching her letters explained. Elves were responsible for the downfall of the empire. They had seemed helpless, and Amelia couldn't help feeling sorry for them. Rosward concluded his tirade by accusing the elves of being responsible for the drought 2 years before, and Amelia caught Nimbus rolling his eyes. "You don't share their opinions," she whispered. "It's not my place to counter the words of a king." "My lady," the courtier responded politely. "True, but I sometimes wonder just what goes on under that wig of yours. Something tells me there's more than courtly etiquette." Rattling around, off to Amelia's ride, Roswart and Frida had moved on. Dwarves aren't much better, but at least they have skills. The king was saying fine stonemasons and jewelers, I'll give them that, but niggardly as an autumn squirrel facing an early snow. The entire lot of them, they can't be trusted. Any one of them would slit your throat. 2 steel to copper tenants, they stick to their own kind, and whisper their outlawed language. Living with dwarves is like trying to domesticate a wild animal. Can't ever truly be done. The conversation died down as another performance started. This time a pair of conjurers pulled apples and augments from their sleeves, then juggled the items. When the act was over, and all the knives and goblets safely, God Nimbus asked, "Doesn't the Empress hail from your kingdom, your majesty?" "No." "Yes." Rosward perked up and nearly spilled his drink. "Lived right there in Dogran. What a terrible mess that was." Afterwards the deacon ran about babbling his tall tales. No one believed him. I certainly didn't. Who would have thought that the heir of Navran would come from that tiny dust speck?